Welcome everybody to expanding the benefit cost analysis for nature-based solutions. We're excited to have almost 2.5 hours together today to walk through this. I've already introduced myself, Anthony Allen. I'm with Save the Sound. You'll hear about how everyone was involved in this project, but we're excited to talk about the results today and get your input, your feedback. Again, this was an invite-only event, and so each of you is here for a reason, and we're all glad you're here. We're hoping to have a really great discussion today, and hopefully this will be revealing or informative in some way for you as well. So as we get started here, the first thing I'd love for everyone to do is just drop in chat, not Q&A, but the chat, your name, your organizational affiliation, and your nearest water body. So that last one's a curveball for you. See how well you know your local hydrology. So for instance, for me, it would be Anthony Allen, Save the Sound. And actually, it's kind of a toss-up. I didn't do the Google measuring distances before this, but it's either the Mill River or New Haven Harbor. So I'm close here to both of those. So go ahead and drop those in the chat. As we go through, at any point, feel free to drop questions in the Q&A. Zach Greenberg from Pew is going to be monitoring the Q&A, and we'll be able to either address questions as we go, or we have some time specifically set aside at various points for Q&A. All right. Now let's figure out how much you know and how much you're coming in with. So we're going to launch this first poll here just to get to know you and the knowledge you're bringing. So the first question here, how familiar are you with benefit cost analysis as a tool and a practice? Your choice is, it's either it's your bread and butter. It's the thing you do all the time. You've dipped your toe in the water. You may have to expand these windows, by the way, to see the full answers, because I can't keep things short. You may have tried it, dipped your toe in the water, but you have questions or concerns. You think you heard someone talk about it once, or you're better off being asked what aliens talk about over breakfast. The second question here, how familiar are you with ecosystem-based benefits and nature-based solutions? Could talk about them all day. You understand the concepts and work with them on a regular basis. You're fairly new to this, but you're interested. Or how about those aliens? Really just not engaged at this point, but you will be after today. So we have some people in the room that do benefit cost analysis a lot. 6 of you. So really happy to have you here. I think you can all teach us some things, which would be great. A lot of us, the majority of us, are kind of somewhere in between. We've heard about it, or we've tried it, but we have some questions. And then in terms of ecosystem-based, well, there was one person who would rather talk about aliens over breakfast. So that's great. We have someone in every category here, and that's exactly what we were hoping for. Familiarity with ecosystem-based benefits and nature-based solutions, similar mix here. So this is great. We have some really experienced folks in the room, and we have a lot of folks who are learning and have questions. All right. So quick introduction, Save the Sound. We're a regional environmental nonprofit. We work across the Long Island Sound region, leading environmental action. We have a number of different program areas, and we work to fight climate change, save endangered lands, protect the Sound and its rivers, and work with nature to restore ecosystems. The team that I'm a part of, the program that I'm a part of, is the Ecological Restoration Team. So we do a lot of hands-on habitat restoration. This is dam removals, green stormwater infrastructure installations, living shorelines, marsh restoration. So we do this work to strengthen natural ecosystems for the benefit of wildlife and communities. And so that'll provide some context for these examples. When we're talking about nature-based solutions, it's something that we do a lot of, and it varies in what it looks like. So these are some examples from current or past projects that Save the Sound has worked on. This is the Maroon Meadows project. This is Dana Dam here that you're seeing, otherwise known as Strong Pond Dam. This project is in progress right now. We've actually notched this dam now, and expect it to be fully removed this summer or fall. And, you know, when we talk about, just quickly to note, when FEMA's definition of a nature-based solution is that they are sustainable planning, design, environmental management, and engineering practices that weave natural features or processes into the built environment to promote adaptation and resilience. So for instance, on a dam removal, where it's more than just removing the structure, we're actually thinking about how to reconstruct the river channel to make it more resilient and natural post-construction. So this is a rendering of what that site is expected to look like or might look like. This is a living shoreline site in Queens that we're working on. So this is the current state. You could see a lot of fragmented marsh there sort of falling into the water. This is the proposed solution or the proposed adaptation. This was like a 17-acre parking lot, Sunken Meadow State Park in New York on the North Shore of Long Island. We retrofitted it with everything from bioswales to tree filter strips to constructed wetlands, all this kind of green stormwater infrastructure to protect this marsh right here that's adjacent from runoff. Previously, it was all kind of running into storm drains and out directly into the marsh. This is the right-of-way bioswale in New Haven. We've done a bunch of these and hope to do a lot more. These similarly keep, they mimic nature and allow stormwater to be uptaken by plants or to be filtered down into the groundwater instead of ending up in our stormwater basins and overflowing into our water bodies. The project that really kicked this whole thing off, though, and is the reason that we're sitting here today, is the Chittenden Park Living Shoreline Project. This is a beach and tidal wetland that's publicly owned. It's owned by the town of Guilford, right on Guilford Harbor. It's experiencing severe erosion. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. And so we found this concept design for a living shoreline at this site. It had been identified in a regional planning report done by SCROG, the South Central Connecticut Regional Council of Governments, who I think is on the line here today, and a number of different firms. And we took this on to help protect the wetland. The marsh behind it is extremely significant, as you'll hear. And it had been prioritized in a lot of different local and regional hazard mitigation plans, but we had a question about whether FEMA would fund it. This was back in 2020, and FEMA, as you'll hear, had just updated their policy to allow ecosystem services to become a more significant or major part of the overall benefits that were factored into a benefit cost analysis. So we had some questions about that. And we went to our local state hazard mitigation office. I think someone from Connecticut Department of Emergency Management and Homeland Security, Demas, is on the line here today as well. Welcome. We went to them. Shout out to Ian and Ken. They're fantastic, and they really helped us think this through. And, you know, ultimately, though, at the time, it was expected. We didn't have a benefit cost analysis done. We didn't know how to do a benefit cost analysis, but Ian and Ken let us know that, you know, because we weren't directly protecting or modifying built infrastructure, critical infrastructure, it was unlikely that this was going to get over a 1.0 benefit cost ratio, which is a measure of eligibility for FEMA funding. So we backed off at that time. But this stuck in our heads, in our minds, as how can we, like, what would it look like? What would it take for nature-based solutions like living shorelines to have all of the various benefits and costs associated with them, and that accrue from restored natural ecosystems to be counted in a benefit cost analysis, so that projects like this would have a shot at this growing pool of funds for the new, FEMA, relatively new at this point, FEMA BRIC program, Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program, which has received increased funding in recent years. So that was our question. And we brought that to Pew Trust and proposed that we would try and run the Chittenden Living Shoreline project through the FEMA benefit cost analysis for ecosystem services, and then propose some expansion to that to allow for more of the benefits that we knew would accrue from the project to be considered in that analysis and hopefully make the project eligible. Pew saw the vision and was interested enough to give us some funding for this work. And we brought Earth Economics on board. So we have Carson Reisner here today from Earth Economics, and we also have Olivia Molden here today. They've been fantastic partners to work with. Zach Greenberg, who I mentioned before from Pew, is on the line. He's been managing this project with us. So I just want to give a word of appreciation for all of them. And then also to our friends from Sea Grant who are on the line. If you're in the Long Island Sound region and you have not made contact with or met your local Long Island Sound Study Sustainable and Resilient Communities extension professional, all 4 of the current extension professionals are on the line here today. We have Deb Abibu, who's represents Connecticut, and then we have Sarah Schaefer-Brown, Sarah Powell, and Elizabeth Hornstein, all represent various parts of New York within the watershed. They're all on the line as well, and they're going to be helping facilitate today. So thank you to the whole team. And now I'm going to kick it over. Based on that poll, it sounds like a lot of you are a lot more familiar with benefit cost analysis than I was, or than our team was when we first got started with this. But nonetheless, I'm going to kick it to Carson at Earth Economics to get us started with an overview of benefit cost analysis. Carson.
Hi, everybody. I'm Carson Reisner. I'm a research analyst at Earth Economics. I was tasked with pretty much doing the research and benefit cost analysis for this project. Anthony gave a great overview of what the purpose and background of this project was. The goal of these initial slides is to get you familiar with benefit cost analysis, ecosystem services, and how ecosystem services are integrated into a benefit cost analysis. Then we'll look at how other federal agencies are incorporating ecosystem services within their decision-making tools. Then we will go through our case study, basically, of the Chittenden project, finish off with our recommendations of the limitations and areas for expansion of FEMA's benefit cost analysis toolkit. So I'll give a brief little introduction of who Earth Economics is. We're a leader in ecological economics. We value the benefits nature provides. We are a 501(c) nonprofit. We've been around since 1998. And we do a lot of work in this resilient communities area, been helping people put together sub-applications to apply for BRIC and things like that. So we have some history here. We worked with FEMA before to help them create their ecosystem service framework. So that's why we were contacted by Anthony to kind of give an insider look into how could this benefit cost analysis toolkit be improved to better represent these nature-based solutions. So a benefit cost analysis is really simple. It's just the weighing of the benefits and costs of a project over its lifetime. As you can see from this little infographic here, is just basically a scale, hopefully more benefits than costs. Next slide. So what the benefit cost analysis toolkit or benefit cost analysis is that systematically compares the quantifiable benefits and costs over the lifetime of an investment opportunity. Since we're all pretty much familiar with benefit cost analysis, I won't bore us with a bunch of the specifics, but basically benefits include any financial returns, avoided damages, quality of life improvements, environmental services, things like that. Costs include construction and operation and maintenance requirements over the lifetime. The result of a benefit cost analysis is a benefit cost ratio, or a BCR. The BCR describes the proportion of benefits compared to the costs. Opportunities that have a BCR above 1.0 are considered cost effective and could be pursued. So what a BCR of 1.0 means is that for each dollar that you spend, you gain $1 in benefits from that investment. So now that we know what a benefit cost analysis are, let's move on to ecosystem services and how they're integrated. So ecosystem services are the benefits that humans receive from the nature. For example, breathable air, drinkable water, nourishing food, or disaster mitigation. So we can measure these and quantify them based on their services and include them within benefit cost analysis. Go ahead and next slide. So here's an example, a little infographic of how ecosystem services are kind of not created, but from how they get from point A to point B where we actually use them. So where they originate is from the ecosystem or the natural capital. In this instance, it's a forest. The ecosystem functions, it has its natural function. In this case, what we're looking at here would be like water capture and storage. So that's how the ecosystem functions. And then what we get out of that, one of the things that we get out of that is reduced flood risk. And that would be a direct ecosystem service of that natural capital or ecosystem. So this just shows how it originates from the environment, transfers through how the environment functions, and then how we use that service or function. Next slide. So as we talked about, ecosystems provide benefits to society. They can be usually broken up into 4 distinct areas, such as provisioning, supporting, regulating, and cultural services. Provisioning services are the things that you can actually extract from nature, such as timber, water, things like that. Supporting services are the biological services, such as like pollination, biological processes. Regulating services would be such as those like regulating your air temperature, clean air, breathable, clean water, things like that. And cultural values or services would be more so like existence values, sense of place, knowing that something exists and that you gain value from that. There's many different ways, and it's the more nuanced of the services, but it's just as important nonetheless. And what's important here is that these services can be quantified monetarily. So through economic theory, there's 2 ways that people use or gain value from these services. They can either directly use the service, such as breathing the clean air, drinking the clean water, or they can not use them, such as the cultural values, which is the sense of place. So knowing, or the existence value, knowing that it's there, or even bequest value, knowing that it will be passed on to a further generation, even though you never used it. So that's kind of the 2 areas that economics looks at how we value things. We either value them through the direct use or setting them aside and not using them. So there's 2 ways to also go through and value these things: a revealed preference and a stated preference methodology. Revealed preferences are used to value the use services of these ecosystems. So for example, we can, if we were going to value clean air, one way to value clean air would be to the avoided costs of hospitalization of breathing polluted air, for example. So those are the avoided costs which we could directly value through the use of the thing. However, for non-use values, it's more difficult because there's no markets that are actually being used, or proxy markets that are actually having transactions being done through them, and we can see the observed consumer behavior. So non-use services are a little bit harder to go through and value. One way that we do that is through stated preference, such as contingent valuation, which is where we use surveys to pretty much parse out how important a service or thing is to somebody and ask them to value that on their own. There's the two areas of evaluation: revealed preference, stated preference. Through these methodologies, basically, we can quantify monetarily the value of these services or estimate them approximately. And that's how they pretty much get used and transferred into a benefit cost analysis. These services and values can be standardized to allow easy transfer of values. If we look at the little display down below, we can see, for example, wetlands provide $10,000 per acre per year. So this is the standardization of the ecosystem service. We can standardize it to a land cover, and then also to a spatial and temporal unit, such as per acre per year. Once we do that, we can easily forecast these benefits into the future within our benefit cost analysis and get the overall BCR throughout time. Next slide. So now that we've went through how ecosystem services are integrated into benefit cost analyses, we thought it'd be interesting to look at how other federal agencies are viewing ecosystem services and including them within the decision-making frameworks. Beginning with NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency. Like most federal agencies, they don't have an established framework to quantify ecosystem services, but they ensure the consideration of ecosystem services through their ecosystem-based management approach. This requires staff to filter agency actions and an alternative based on its impacts to the environment and people. They prioritize watershed scale restoration and management because they recognize the links between ecosystem health, the overall health of the ecosystem, not just one part of it, and the services that are provided to people. Through their management and knowledge of marine resources, they provide critical knowledge and resources on the links between ecosystem health and the impacts that it has on the services provided. With the research, NOAA aims to be a support and innovative federal decision-making framework. So the key there is that they have basically a holistic approach here. And what that really comes down to is their integrated ecosystem assessment. When they're managing fisheries, that's when it is most notably pursued. And what is unique about this integrated ecosystem assessment is that it includes humans into the decision-making process, recognizing that we're not separate from the environment, but a part of it, and balance trade-offs to achieve their agency's goals. So even though they're not quantifying ecosystem services, they're being thought of within the framework and the decision-making process. Go ahead, next slide.
Yeah, and Carson, I also want to just note that we have folks from most of these agencies that we're going through on the line here today. So if you are a representative of one of these agencies and you want to share some resources to how you do benefit cost analysis in the chat, or you want to say anything about it, please feel free.
And Carson, just right before you get to this slide, Anthony, I just wanted to flag a few comments and questions in the chat. We can either, hold those, and Carson, you can address them, or, feel free to pick those out now. I defer to you on that.
Yeah, sure. Let's check them out. Is it possible to provide more detail around how ecosystem service values and average standard values can be established? So ecosystem service values and average standard values, the way that they're established is typically through literature reviews and benefit transfers. Basically what happens there is primary research is done to identify the links between ecosystem health and the services that are provided. What can be done is you can collect a pool of literature appropriate to your settings. So that's the key of benefit transfer methodology, is that you have to appropriately transfer one study with similar settings and to what you're applying it to, basically. And so that's how you can kind of get a baseline for the value of ecosystem services and easily incorporate that into your own benefit cost analysis without doing that primary research. So hopefully that answers Elsa's question. And we have another question: confused that valuation regarding wetlands, it seems low. There are many different wetland types. Is it true that a true standard for wetlands, or just a potential? So yeah, so exactly, that's a great question. What I believe that we're getting at here is that not each wetland is not one wetland is not the same as all other wetlands, especially when you're going against a huge spatial area like a national, such as the United States. And so that is one thing that we will talk about more and later on into the presentation. So hopefully I answered that one as well. If there's any other questions, please feel free and we can go through them again as needed. Excellent. So moving on to the Army Corps of Engineers. So the Army Corps of Engineers is mostly primarily responsible for managing our nation's waterways. They have developed their own benefit cost analysis framework. Within this framework, they encourage the inclusion of all environmental impacts. However, they're limited to qualitative assessments. There's not any quantitative values going on here from the best of my knowledge. However, they are encouraged to consider all environmental impacts. It's just not quantified. Throughout time, the popularity of nature-based solutions has increased, and the Army Corps of Engineers has realized that they need to provide more resources and guidelines for their staff to help them assess these strategies. Because of this, they produced two main editions in 2013 and 2016. These reports are meant for their internal staff to help them figure out how to value these nature-based solutions and appropriately consider their alternatives. The newest addition to the Army Corps of Engineers is their Engineering with Nature program, which aims to enable a more sustainable delivery of economic, social, and environmental benefits associated with infrastructure. So even though there is no quantifying of ecosystem services, it's apparent that the Army Corps of Engineers is committed to sustainable design and acknowledge the ecosystem services they provide, even if they're not required to be quantified within their frameworks. So the BLM is interesting because of their multiple use and sustained yield mandate. The BLM manages over a vast, diverse inventory of land, basically. And because of this multiple use sustained yield, they had to figure out a way in which that they could, weigh benefits and costs of trade-offs of different management strategies for regional and even activities. So their solution was to create regional and land use management plans. These regional plans lay out strategies that will be used to manage the region's resources. These strategies are analyzed based on their expected physical, biological, and environmental impacts. After the regional management plan has been established, the process is repeated to analyze the proposed land use activities or the activities that can take place on these lands. Although there is no specific framework that requires the quantification of ecosystem services, it is kind of implied through their mandate of multiple use and sustained yields. So acknowledging the fact that our resources are providing services for us and we must sustain those for future generations. So it is indirectly being looked at and qualitatively included within benefit cost analyses, but the services are not directly quantified as well.
Just a quick note on this one for folks who are interested or may have seen this, that the BLM just proposed public lands rule that would establish a framework to ensure healthy landscapes, abundant wildlife habitat, clean water, and balanced decision-making on our nation's public lands. So this is actually up for, I think, for comment and could be passed here this year, and it would put conservation on an equal footing to other uses. So they're making moves too.
The USDA, I was actually pleasantly surprised with their decision framework. They actually do have a benefit cost analysis framework that does quantify ecosystem services. This was prompted under the Water Resource Act of 2007, specifically the principles, requirements, and guidelines. They created a BCA framework to analyze the lifetime benefits and costs of a project, and also the non-action alternative, which I think is important to consider as well and highlight. They prioritized watershed scale management and analysis to ensure both on-site and off-site impacts are captured and ecosystems are holistically managed. So that's another key thing to highlight as well, as the on-site as well as off-site impacts, because Nothing happens in a vacuum. Downstream, upstream impacts are a thing. Their benefit cost analysis uses the MEA, the Millennial Ecosystem Assessment Framework for ecosystem services, to quantify the value of those services and appropriately consider the impacts to the environment. It's important to note that they do not restrict any valuation type or ecosystem services, even allowing for non-use values to be included. The U.S. Forest Service is mandated by Congress to ensure their lands support healthy and functional forest ecosystems critical for public health. To follow this mandate, they created the pretty much management plans similar to BLM in the sense of, we're looking at a regional area and we are taking stock of what's here and ensuring that it's sustainable into the future. In 2012, they passed a new planning rule, which was to guide the inclusion of ecosystem services within management plans so that projects are ecologically, socially, and economically sustainable. All of these plans do not quantify the value of ecosystem services. They do link actions to human well-being and project impacts. Currently, they have the National Ecosystem Service Strategy Team, which is helping to develop frameworks and integrate processes and tools within the agency to include ecosystem services. So hopefully there will be more quantification in the future. We'll see how the NEST team progresses though. And finally, to the meat and potatoes of our project, FEMA. So FEMA's mission is to help people prepare for, respond to, and recover from all natural hazards. To accomplish their goals, they offer many funding opportunities to support resilience investments and post-disaster recovery. As mandated by the Stafford Act, these resilience investments must be cost-effective, meaning that they show more lifetime benefits than construction and operation and maintenance costs. To comply with this mandate, FEMA created their benefit cost analysis toolkit so that projects be properly analyzed and to the technical acumen that is required by these federal projects. When created, the toolkit was meant to analyze benefits and costs for acquisition projects, their most favorable resilient strategy at the time. However, over time, resilient strategies and intervention types have evolved, and so too did the toolkit. Nature-based solutions and sustainable designs became more common, and it was argued that many of their benefits and of their projects were not being quantified by the toolkit, namely their ecosystem services. In 2013, FEMA revised their BCA toolkit and worked with consultants to integrate a framework that would account for ecosystem services provided by nature-based solutions. Since then, FEMA has continually revised and improved their benefit cost analysis toolkit to more comprehensively record benefits and costs. With these revisions, FEMA now quantifies ecosystem services using the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Framework as well. This approach uses the land covers as proxies for ecosystem service types and uses 4 categories of ecosystem services, which we've talked about before. As of now, FEMA quantifies ecosystem services for 9 land cover types using their benefit transfer methodology. This methodology uses primary research, like I've briefly talked about before, from peer-reviewed sources and transferred the quantified value of that service from one location to a similar location or similar settings. To ensure appropriate values, best management practices are followed when selecting these studies, which I touched on a little bit before, but it's just key to really highlight that because it's really easy to transfer one value to an inappropriate setting and kind of skew your analysis that way. So it's important to be aware of these these nuances of the benefit transfer methodology. So here's an example of how FEMA breaks up their ecosystem services according to their 9 land cover types. So you can see the land cover types up on the columns up here and the services on the rows. And at the very bottom, you can see the total value of these areas or land covers. It's important to note here all the gaps. These gaps are represented just literature gaps, so that what that means is that the current literature does not have a set understanding of how these land cover types are interacting or providing these services, such so like, for example, urban green space and biological control, it either does it, because it's blank, we can either assume that it does not have biological control, or it's just not well understood how it interacts. So that explains why there are these gaps in these valuations. Not everything can be included, but we have to work with the available literature that we have. So this just is another example of showing that we don't fully understand how ecosystem services are related all the way across landscapes, but we can always work to fill those gaps in. It is also interesting to note the vast differences of values for different land cover types. If we look at beach and dunes, we see almost $300,000 per acre of value across these ecosystem services. As we can see, these are being driven by recreation and tourism, as well as aesthetic value. So this is just an interesting view to see how FEMA's values were created. As we talked about before, FEMA has always been continuously updating their values and attempting to make their toolkit better. We thought it would just be interesting to look at the 2016 adopted values versus the 2022 values that are now being used. So we see that there are more land coverage being included, and as well as more services being analyzed as well. So it's just interesting to see the change over time, basically, and how that can really impact a project's cost competitiveness, especially on a national level. Here's some great resources for those that are not super familiar with FEMA and its benefit cost analysis toolkit, and also just how ecosystems are used within FEMA. This is their 2022 policy update on the left, and as well as their the BRIC guide for local communities on the right. These are two really great sources. If you haven't looked at them, I would highly suggest looking at them.
Yeah, and Carson, just a note, I did see that Olivia dropped the second one here, the FEMA ecosystem service value updates from 2022 in the chat. So you can find it there. Super helpful. It really dives into, you know, how each of those values are established that you just saw on the previous slides. All right. So Carson just, I mean, that was a really fast and yet somehow also detailed, great job, Carson, overview of benefit cost analysis, both for FEMA, but also for a bunch of other federal agencies. And I did see someone in chat also say or note, I think it was Ethan, noted that, you know, there's efforts right now at the federal government to implement cross-agency efforts to develop tool sets for this kind of valuation work. And I think we actually referenced that in the report, unless I'm mistaken. Yeah, and thanks, Sarah from FEMA. Hi, Sarah. Also mentions that FEMA released a second publication on nature-based solutions, and the link that Olivia just shared in chat has both of those. So a lot of great resources being shared. And right now we're just gonna we're gonna do a little temperature check. We're gonna see how folks are feeling. That was a lot of information. So we want to know how helpful that was and how you're feeling at this point. So here's another poll for you. We just want to know, relative to the start of the workshop, how helpful has this been? So do you have a much better understanding of what BCA is and what the FEMA BCA is used for? Do you have some more clarity about benefit cost analysis? Were you already well versed in it, so not a lot of that was new? Or are you not really following? In which case, we can help or maybe flag some additional resources and maybe follow up. So we'll give a second for this. Y'all are fast though. this is going fast.
And Anthony, this is Zach again, and maybe while folks are voting, I did just want to flag a excuse me, a question from Wayne in the chat a little earlier. Carson, I think this is directed at you, but Wayne was asking about the millennial ecosystem standards and whether those are accepted formally by federal agencies or referenced in federal programs.
Yeah, so the millennial ecosystem service standards, it's a framework through which we categorize ecosystem services into those 4 broad categories that I described earlier. I'm not there, it's not a set of values per se. It's just a framework through which you can value ecosystem services. I'm not sure if it's formally accepted by federal agencies. However, it is a popular framework to use. And it's easy to understand one as well. It's very common, and so maybe that's why it's more prevalent.
Yeah, and you know, in the 2022 values update, you can see how that framework is actually used directly to help categorize things. I think it might be referenced somewhere in there directly. All right, polling for understanding. Let's see. So this is looking good. We have 1 person to follow up with. Happy to do that. Some of you, that's about the same number, who said, you know, I do this. It's actually the exact same number of you that said I do this all the time. So that's not surprising that you're well versed, and not a lot of this is new. But for most of you, this is marginally or very, very helpful. So glad to hear that. That was a very, very fast overview. There's a lot more you can dive into here, but glad that overview was helpful. Thank you, Carson. All right. Just a reminder to folks. Yeah, thanks, John. John loved the overview of how other agencies handle ecosystem service benefits. We do have 1 more question here, Carson, before we move on, from Ben at GZA. Land cover based benefit values from FEMA apply to new habitats or simply keeping existing habitats. For example, if the project area includes an existing wetland, does the full value of 10,000, just for this example, apply, or the value or is the value only valid if a project creates or restores a wetland? I almost can answer that, but I want you to answer it, Carson.
Yeah, no, we had a great conversation with some folks at FEMA before this webinar. And basically what we gathered from them is that you can't value existing things already there. It'd be almost like double counting, for instance. So when it's acceptable to value something that's already existing is if you can prove through modeling techniques that are up to the analytical rigor of FEMA. So basically providing professional services showing erosion models, things like that. So basically what you have to do is you have to make the case to FEMA saying, like, if we don't do anything, this land will be lost, or the services will be lost. Then you can include that into your BCA if your project is directly enhancing or conserving these areas. However, if it's just a area behind something and it was already existing, then you wouldn't be able to include that into your benefit cost analysis.
Great. Okay. A reminder too to folks, you can also use the Q&A function for questions. That way we don't lose them. I'm always concerned with chat as other conversations are happening that we'll miss a question. So feel free to use the Q&A function as well. We're going to move on now. And a big part of this report, and you all got the report by email, or you should have if you registered. So, and we can send it around again afterward as it's finalized. But a big part of it was using, as I said, the Chittenden Park Living Shoreline Project as a case study to really kind of stress test the benefit cost analysis to see how it did or did not, how it was or was not able to incorporate the values that that we knew would accrue from this, or that we felt should be able to be included. So I'm going to give some context, because I know that not everyone in the room here is from the Long Island Sound region. Not everyone's familiar with Connecticut and our geography. So the Chittenden Park site is in Guilford, Connecticut. It's a town of about 22,000 people. We actually have Janice, the town engineer, is on the line today. Hi, Janice. It's a town of about 22,000 people, and it has some of the most ecologically significant marsh habitat in the state. And Connecticut and the whole region has lost a lot of our coastal wetland, in particular, about 27-30%, something like that, to this point, and you know, another 30% or so is expected this century. So we're losing it at a faster and sorry, I just randomly got muted. This is particularly true at sites like Chittenden. So there's a lot of erosion happening at this site, and it's the leading edge, as you can see in this photo, of a large marsh complex, the West River marsh area. It's about 155 acres. Our project site, we think, is about 11 acres, and it's kind of down here. You'll see that in a later slide. But it's the leading edge, and it's eroding very quickly. So to give you a sense of that, you know, you can see here we use the tidal creek as a reference point. You can see this drawing from back in 1880, and you can see just how far that marsh extended. And then by 1934, a lot of that leading the lower marsh there was largely submerged, although you can kind of still see a shadow of it here. And then by 1965, we're almost eroded all the way to the tidal creek. And now today, the tidal creek is actually coastal. So there's been, I think, 375 plus feet of erosion here. And it's expected to continue at about, I think, 50 feet per decade, something like that. So this is significant for endangered or threatened species as well that use this habitat. Salt marsh sparrow up in our region is one of the most threatened and one of the most significant. So to the point where there's actually a whole habitat prioritization tool that's been created, and it ranks each of these patches of potential habitat for suitability and you know, how high quality it is for salt marsh sparrow. And this Pat, you can see the arrows pointing to the project site here. This is the West River Marsh area that's really being protected by this leading edge. And that patch of marsh is ranked 8th out of 487 by this tool in Connecticut. So really, really ecologically significant. And, you know, it's interesting to think about what that means. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later on, what that means in terms of, you know, how valuable is this? You know, this would certainly fall into the category of non-use value in a lot of ways, but how significant is this from the perspective of ecological health and biodiversity to have places like this remain healthy and intact over time? So this is a view from across the West River, from the other side, from Chaffinch Island side. You can see the project site here. And all the erosion that's happening. There's some low-lying residences over on Seaside Avenue over here. Seaside Avenue is a regularly inundated road now. And then up, as we go sort of this way up the river and to the east, there's a lot of other development. But on this site, there's not a whole lot here in terms of built infrastructure. Is part of what makes it so great. And able to provide so many ecosystem services. But you do have playing fields, and here's the tidal creek that you just saw that's now coastal kind of coming out right here. So that should give some context. And now, you know, when we were thinking about this project and looking at it for consideration by FEMA, one of the things that we hit on or landed on was, well, there's not really much we can claim in terms of properties that are being directly protected by this project as we work on this project site, right? And so, you know, this is, we have a little key over here. So the little red circles are critical infrastructure facilities. This is as identified in plans and hazard mitigation plans of the town of Guilford. So you have critical facilities. This is the Amtrak line here going through the Northeast Corridor. We all know how significant that is. And here's Seaside Avenue, which is currently regularly inundated. These other roadways here, though, are all residential, and they're all identified as being at high risk of future inundation due to sea level rise and coastal erosion. And then the arrows here, the double-sided arrows, are evacuation routes. So really critical pathways here in emergency situations. And then finally, this is a crossing. I think this is Route 146 that's was identified as being highly vulnerable to sea level rise. So even though, and this is my attempt, my clumsy attempt at tracing the West River Marsh here, the extent that you just saw in the past slide as well. But really the key message here, the key takeaway is that even though this project site is relatively small in terms of the overall West River Marsh and the surrounding area, it does indirectly protect all of this in some way by keeping erosion contained and restoring sort of ecosystems that'll provide those buffering services and those ecosystem services down here, such that it doesn't continue to erode and flooding gets worse and worse up in this area. So we you'll see in a bit, when we ran the benefit cost analysis, we really only used at this point ecosystem service values. It's what we were really most curious about, honestly. But part of that was we just recognized that we don't really have properties that we can include as being directly protected. So that is that's some context for you. And here's what's proposed at the site. Again, MMI, which is now SLR. I think we have some SLR folks on the line, and GEI put this together. We may have GEI folks on the line too. Put this together for that framework that I mentioned, where we pulled this concept design from and started to run with it. And so what you need to know here is, you know, that this is the proposed design includes a number of different restored land cover types, one of which is beaches and dunes. So if you remember from that chart that Carson brought up, the chart of ecosystem service values, beaches and dunes are by far the highest valued at this point. And so just the inclusion, or the fact that we were restoring beaches and dunes, actually makes this, as you'll see, something that is feasible or is fundable by FEMA. But back in 2020, when we were first looking at this, beaches and dunes were not a land cover type that had a value in FEMA's framework. So at that time, neither was shellfish reefs, which we may have some of that out here as well. And SLR is actually working with Save the Sound to do the final design for this site right now. So we're not sure exactly what'll end up being part of this project, but shellfish reef may be up to 20% of the land cover type. And that was also not an accepted land cover type back in 2020. So back then, with the lower value for wetlands, this would have had a very paltry score. I think the guidance we got from Demas back then was correct. It would not have scored well. So this is the context. This is what is planned at the site. And hopefully that gives you an idea of why we felt like this was such a great case study to use, because it doesn't have those traditional built infrastructure, critical infrastructure right adjacent to the site or included in the site that we could say confidently this is directly protecting it, and we can show that. But it does have tremendous ecological value, and the restored condition will have a mix of land cover types included. Carson, I don't know if you want to take this or you want me to take this.
Whichever you prefer. Yeah, I can go ahead and go through it.
Go for it.
Yeah, sure. So these are the different scenarios that we ran. Like Anthony mentioned, they're still in design phase right now. So there's a couple different outlooks that could be implemented. Different distributions of land cover types, including coastal wetlands, beach and dunes, shellfish, reefs. And also, we don't have a set budget right now as well. So we are playing around with different construction and O&M costs as well, to kind of stress test the benefit cost analysis toolkit, essentially. So what we did is we used different makeups of likely scenarios that could be included, and the results for the resulting benefit cost benefit cost ratios, sorry, was quite drastic. If we think back to that infographic that I shared about FEMA's ecosystem service values for the different land cover types, we can really start to shed light to see how those values really impact how competitive somebody is or a project is. If we look at scenario number 1, our highest ranking benefit cost ratio, we see 8 acres of wetlands and 3.08 acres of beach and dune. Looking back or remembering back to that framework that we were looking at again, we could probably anticipate that a majority of this value is being pressured or contributed to the beach and dune areas, having an ecosystem service value around 300,000, I believe. So to kind of play around with seeing how a project's land cover types for its intervention area could affect the BCR, if we look down to the 6th scenario where we are using a majority of coastal wetlands and a little bit of shellfish reef acreage, we can see that our benefit cost ratio goes down below 1 to 0.31. So meaning every dollar you spend, you get 31 cents of benefits through it. So this just really highlights the drastic change through which can happen when you're planning your project. So this is something to keep in mind for when you're thinking of designs for your project as well. Just understanding the black box that is the benefit cost analysis toolkit, and kind of using it in a way that's favorable to you and your project. So that this is just an example of how of what that looks like, to better help people understand. I'm not going to run through all these scenarios, but if we want to just take some time and kind of look at them, it's interesting to see how minuscule changes in the land use can drastically impact the benefit cost ratio.
Yeah, and again, I think what's really interesting to me here is, and it's a credit to FEMA and the advances that they've made. And I saw that a couple of folks from FEMA, including Rebecca, just joined. So not to call you out, but we're really glad to have you here, and they've been tremendously helpful in this project. Just to point out, back in 2020, when I think the accepted ecosystem service values were still from the 2016 update, shellfish reef was not a land cover type that had a value. Neither was beaches and dunes. So if you look down at all of these, none of them would have produced a BCR over 1. And I could say that with confidence because we have this one here, which is almost entirely coastal wetland, which would have been the only accepted value type. It would have had a lower value at that time, and that got a 0.38 BCR. So that change that happened with the 2022 update has made this project, and I think this one here is what we feel like is maybe the most likely at this point, given what we know, number 3, and that would accrue a BCR 4.13. So all of a sudden with that change, and that those new values, this project on ecosystem services alone becomes eligible. And what I don't think we've mentioned yet is that in 2020, FEMA made it possible to incorporate ecosystem service values into the benefit cost analysis without hitting a certain threshold of traditional benefits first. So previously you had to have a BCR of 0.75 before you could incorporate any ecosystem service values. In 2020, they got rid of that minimum. And so now a project like this can be eligible just on ecosystem service benefits alone. Okay. We set some time aside for Q&A here. So I see a few. Zach, what are you seeing that jumps out at you?
Oh, we've got a few here. Why don't I hit the Q&A function first? But another one here from Wayne. Is it acceptable to estimate the annual O&M costs with no coastal storm damages to living shoreline vegetation, beaches, and dunes? And I'm happy to reread that or.
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to figure out where I could read it myself. Okay, is acceptable to estimate the annual O&M cost with no coastal storm damages. Yeah, so O&M costs, well, so maybe hopefully I'm understanding this correctly. What this question is asking is it okay to estimate your O&M costs without I guess projecting any coastal storm damages to your living shoreline? So basically like a what do they call that? Liability, basically. So that's a good question.
Is kind of that the owners of the living shoreline are pretty vulnerable the first year. So in the case of Guilford, the municipality, and we don't have control over knowing when a storm could hit, but the most vulnerable part is when the vegetation is brand new and, say you plant in the spring. We did one in Fenwick, Connecticut. We had everything planted by May, June, and then in August we got Storm Henri, and it survived, but it was close. And when we were considering construction the previous year in November, we were still getting coastal storms, because it had a direct exposure to Long Island Sound. So we decided to put off the construction, wait till we get to the spring. And so it's just, it's a risk of building these that they're vulnerable because we're waiting for them to grow. But from the standpoint of coming up with a favorable benefit cost ratio, should you put in some probability of replanting, just because, say in Connecticut, DEEP will give you a 5-year permit saying you're going to go out there and keep us informed of everything that's happening. And a lot of time that's taken on by the land trust or the owner, municipality. And they have to make a decision. Do we do some extra O&M or do we just wait and see if it recovers?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I would say, so the way that the benefit cost toolkit functions right now, it does it on an annual basis and you can't change that from year to year. So I would suggest taking like an average of, like building a contingency basically and average that out across your lifetime. That would just be my recommended idea. FEMA may have a different approach. I haven't heard this question before, so this is the first time I'm hearing of it. There is no way to include that within the BCA right now, so that's a great question. But another way to potentially do it would be on a probability basis, like you were saying. So like how we do flood damages, you take the overall exposure and cost and divide it by the probability over the timeline. And then you can maybe average that out, like use that as your O&M per year, with that taking into the probability into account, right? So like, let's say if you have a 10% chance over 100 years, you would take your total exposure and then take that 10%. I'm sorry, I'm thinking off the top of my head and I'm a little sick right now. So,
Yeah, I'm thinking we think of these in terms of a 25-year life cycle.
Right. And so I would somehow incorporate the probability into that. And so like take your exposure times the probability, and then that would be your estimated cost.
Yeah, I think this is probably something that's worth thought and conversation, maybe in a breakout, one of the breakouts later on.
The other thing we were
could
thinking,
certainly
you could see if you could get it insured over the construction period, maybe the first year. You know, you could probably find an insurance policy that would say, okay, if a storm comes and completely wipes out what you just planted, you know, here's the premium. Now you'd add that insurance premium into the cost of
to the cost. Yeah,
That might
that's
be a better
interesting.
way to do it than to try to assume like, what if the 1% storm comes the first year?
Yeah,
We plan on that, but it could happen.
that's a really great idea, Wayne. And actually something that I will bring back to our team.
And Connecticut is the insurance state, so
We are, yeah.
the right insurance
We could do that well.
we're in trouble.
Yeah. All right. I know we had a couple other questions here. It looks like Olivia's answering one that Becky asked about what we included in the analysis. I'm gonna see whether we can answer those in writing as we go here, and I'm gonna try and move us along because we are a little bit behind here, if that is okay. And if you're interested in diving deeper into the BCA, there's a breakout for that later on with Carson. And if you're interested in having more conversation about those specific values and how we might fill in some of those gaps and things like that, there's a breakout for that too. So, Carson.
Sorry about that, I was on mute. Yeah, so through our work with Save the Sound, we identified 3 major areas or limitations of the BCA toolkit. Mostly these come from just the limitations of the actual program, like the actual tool itself, but also the way in which FEMA views the natural environment and how we can include those within the toolkit itself. So these limitations we found were the mission and capacity of the toolkit itself when it was created, and the current capacity and resources today to help sub-applicants create their defend their projects. Simplistic ecosystem service framework, that we'll go into more details of this later, but over broadly describing it, it misses out some of the nuances of our projects, and we will put that in context of the Chittigan project as well, so we can make those connections from what Anthony was talking about earlier and how all those benefits are not being quantified within the toolkit itself. And then also the inclusion of ecosystem services being restricted to site boundaries and viewing the nature as a natural infrastructure and analyzing it as such and on an equal playing ground as built infrastructure. Go ahead, next slide, Anthony. So mission and capacity. This one really hits towards when the toolkit was really created. So when it was created, FEMA was mostly using it for acquisition projects. At this time, the resiliency projects were limited, catering specifically towards property acquisitions to reduce the total capital exposed to hazards. And this was FEMA's kind of bread and butter, basically, because it is a guarantee that you will not have this loss in the future. You're removing it from exposure, basically. So that was the basis through which the toolkit was created, and that has kind of limited its flexibility and ability to, you know, account for the more nuanced benefits of a project. Over time, strategies have changed, and there's many approaches which we were talking about. And the truth is that it's just not flexible enough to compensate for the added complexities presented by nature-based solutions. And this ultimately places them at a competitive disadvantage, especially at the national scale. Also, by design, the toolkit's not equipped to walk users through the process to effectively record and defend their project benefits. Specifically, this references towards the conservation of the wetlands that are going to be eroded within Chittagong. So that was kind of the area which inspired this limitation. Basically, there is no set way for a user to easily and there was no resources to walk a user through to figure out how to value ecosystem services that weren't directly at the intervention area. Another limiting factor is that, you know, regional staff are often extremely busy and may not have enough time to meet with the sub-applicant and, you know, fully understand the project and provide guidance, but also the resources that are there to help sub-applicants develop it are not up to date. I don't want to say up to date, but it's just that the policy is rapidly changing. It takes a long time to develop these resources, and it seems that some of these things are a little more nuanced in terms of how you can incorporate these nature-based benefits into the ecosystem toolkit. And from firsthand experience for myself, when it comes to the ecosystem services and trying to finagle them into the benefit cost analysis toolkit, there's not a lot of guidance provided by FEMA in the documentation. It's mostly just a cut and dry walkthrough, like here's a property that's not being damaged anymore, so here's the benefit. So that is a little bit the motivation for, you know, expanding our resources and the toolkit itself to more intuitively help support sub-applicants in the development of their benefit cost analysis toolkit. So the simplistic ecosystem service framework, as we were talking about before, the Chittagong shoreline was, you know, protecting these areas also, but it's also habitat for endangered species and things like that. The coastal, geez, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here. The coastal wetlands were also providing services such as hazard mitigation. But the way that these are, you know, incorporated and valued within the toolkit is that it's a national estimate for one land cover type, regardless from what is being protected or how it's interacting or the level of scarcity that these things are at the site itself. So having multiple land covers and allowing for the transfer of values is a step in the right direction, but having standardized national values amidst considerable nuance, both the form of the nuance and also the magnitude of the project benefits. For example, this framework assumes that 1 acre of coastal wetlands will provide the same value regardless of specific hazards, exposed assets, and the function that they mitigate risk through. Like I said before, it ignores the relative scarcity of certain land covers in different regions, and as well as other unique locational characteristics. So through this standardization of national values at the land cover level, we're missing out on a lot of unique project benefits that are occurring, but are not allowed to be quantified or are not quantified through the simplistic ecosystem service framework.
Hey, Carson, before we move on from this slide,
Yeah.
Becky had a question about how the values for coastal wetland, I think it was shellfish reef and one other, maybe inland wetland, were calculated. And so, you know, this helps break it down a little bit. And then I would just say that in that 2022 ecosystem service value update that was shared in chat earlier, it goes in depth into, you know, how each of these particular values for each ecosystem service type were determined. So that is actually a tremendously helpful document, and can help to tease out, you know, sort of where these specific values come from. But, you know, to Carson's point, right, for coastal wetland, I think the first thing that hit me when I saw this chart for the first time is that coastal wetland seemed very low to me. I just, you know, as someone who has gained more and more awareness of how much our coastal wetlands mean to us and how much they provide for us, it seemed very low, especially in comparison to beaches and dunes. But the reality here is, you know, FEMA and whoever they're working with, or Earth Economics has worked with them in the past on this, are limited to what kind of data is available to back this up. So really, when you see all these gaps or low values and that kind of thing, it's kind of a call to action to academics, if we have any academics on the line, or modelers, or anyone who economists who's interested in trying to parse out or investigate regional or national values for these things, for these ecosystem services by land cover type.
Yeah, and last but not least, the site boundaries and viewing nature as natural infrastructure. So the toolkit records ecosystem services for only the intervention area or site extent, which can present problems for projects that seek to protect natural infrastructure that would have been lost without the intervention as a hazard mitigation strategy, like the Chittagong project. Therefore, ecosystem services that would have been lost without the project are not being considered within the application process. And so what we're really doing here is trying to advocate for more long-term resilience, investing a little bit today to mitigate these erosion, to protect a larger swath of land that provides immense ecosystem services. But those services are not making its way into the benefit cost analysis toolkit in an easy and understandable way for sub-applicants to actually use. Given these limitations, we found 3 areas for expansion, or expanding the BCA or improving it. One way would be to just expand the resources to help sub-applicants walk through this black box that is the BCA toolkit, and understand how they can kind of finagle it in ways that's acceptable to FEMA. And also either that or modify the BCA toolkit itself. For example, you know, including more dialogue boxes, more options, things like that for a sub-applicant or a user to easily go through without much prior experience or research into their area, but and defend their project on an equal basis as other types of projects that employ more gray infrastructure, for example. But that was the first one that we really nailed down on, is either we could, you know, expand the resources to help people finagle the BCA toolkit as it is now, or we could expand and modify the BCA toolkit to be more user-friendly. The environment as critical and natural infrastructure. So currently there's not a clear way to record the ecosystem services of protected lands, which, as we discussed earlier, puts projects at a competitive disadvantage, such as the Chittagong. FEMA should alter the BCA toolkit or create a process for users to easily record all ecosystem services that are protected or enhanced by a project. And basically what we are advocating for here is viewing nature at the same level as built infrastructure. So if a levee was built, all the areas that are now protected are going to be valued, but not the same as done for the natural infrastructure, where if we built a levee, but the coastal wetlands behind that are now protected, there's no clear way for sub-applicants to include that within their BCA. So essentially, we just want to put nature on an equal playing field as built infrastructure, basically. and not restrict that to just the site boundaries, but all protected lands as well. So yeah, and then finally, create new methodologies to incorporate more precise ecosystem services or recreational values. So as we were looking at that, the table of ecosystem services for the different land cover types, we saw the gaps in there, and also acknowledging how, different land covers interact differently throughout different areas of the nation. I think somebody said, for example, in the chat, the recreation for a beach in Florida is going to be a lot different from recreation on a beach in Maine. And it's going to have different values, but they're going to be recorded the same throughout this framework. So allowing users to incorporate new methodologies, allowing them to maybe go out and do their own surveys and incorporate that and easily incorporate that into the BCA framework would be preferable, basically. Just that could be one way, or maybe even providing regional values, say like a Northeast land cover values, Southeast, whatever it may be, but just breaking it up into more smaller regions so that we could more representatively transfer ecosystem service values to better represent the project itself. You have anything to expand on there, Anthony?
No, I would say that, we had the opportunity to talk through a lot of this with Rebecca and her team at FEMA. Well, Rebecca at FEMA, and they are out ahead on this stuff. I mean, they're thinking about most, if not all of this already, and are very open to these ideas. And so I think we can expect a lot more in terms of these changes and the possibility of getting some of these values and methods of evaluation into BCAs for these projects in the future. But yeah, these are all actually kind of the themes for our breakouts. So if you're interested in this, in any of these in particular, we'll be discussing them more soon. So actually right now, but we're not going to go right into breakouts because we have been going for an hour and a half, and that is a long time to be listening to other people's voices. So before we get into the more collaborative interaction section of this, we're going to take a little break. We're going to break for about 10 minutes, come back at 2:10. So in the meantime, you can put questions in Q&A. Feel free to mull over these breakouts, or just step away and get a bite or something like that. We'll see you back here at 2:10.
Looks like we have pretty much everybody. I'll just go ahead and start now, and everybody can kind of catch up if they funnel in. So I will share my screen and we will get started. So, okay, get rid of this. All right, so the first thing we have to do is we have to download the benefit cost analysis toolkit. It's an add-on in the Microsoft Excel application, and you also have to download the toolkit from their site. So if you just go to Google, type in FEMA BCA toolkit, select this first one that comes up. We'll go ahead and scroll down, and right here it says download the BCA toolkit. We'll go ahead and download it. Wait for it to pop up in our downloads. Should be named FEMA BCA Toolkit, version 6.0. And when you open that program or that file, it should open up to a screen that looks like this. And what you need to do next is actually go into your inserts, your add-ins, get add-ins. Through the search, you can just type in FEMA. And you can go ahead and just add it on there. What that will do is it will bring a FEMA BCA side dialog box here. So if you do not have this add-on installed before you open this, it will just kind of give you this blank screen off to your left here. And then once you actually download the add-in in your Excel program, it will give you this area over here, which will allow you to actually open up the calculator. So once you have done those two initial steps, we can go ahead and open it. And this is the first thing that will pop up into your screen. This is the home view. This is where all of your benefits and costs and your benefit cost ratio will be presented to you at the end. So one thing to kind of note here is that FEMA's benefit cost analysis toolkit functions based off of properties. So you can have one mitigation action, such as like a living shoreline, like the Chittagong shoreline, and that will be one intervention type. But that one intervention type might protect, let's say, 5 properties. What you would have to do is add each of the 5 properties into the benefit cost analysis toolkit. And at the end, it will aggregate the benefits and costs for each property into a total project benefit cost analysis. So it gets a little weird in that sense where we have one intervention type, but we have to add multiple properties. But that's just the way that the toolkit works. As we were talking about before, the toolkit was created based off of the anticipation of using it only for property acquisitions. So in that light or that context, it kind of makes sense why we have to add it on at the property level. So that's one thing to kind of understand. And also, I forgot to mention, if we have any questions throughout this whole process, go ahead and like raise your hand or put it in the comments or the chat, and my colleague will help flag me that there's a comment or a question, and we can answer it live right on the spot, so that we don't lose it throughout the process. Maybe what we could do is just like there's 3 main pages of the benefit cost analysis toolkit, so maybe we can answer questions at the end of each page. Looks like we have a question already. How do I get the add-on bit? So I'll go back and show you how to do that. So to get the add-on, we'll go to Insert, Add-ins, Get Add-ins, Search, type in FEMA, and bam, should be the first one that comes up. Go ahead and add it to it. And then you might have to go through, let's see, how was it? A bit more. You might have to go to My Add-ins and manage it from here and actually select it and add it if it's not already downloaded onto your toolbar. So when you open up that initial template that we downloaded from the web, once you have it added on and actually implemented in there, yeah, admin manage. So I would just try to, if you can't see it and can't get it to install, I would go into the add-ins here and add it again. Make sure that it's just going from your add-ins onto your actual Excel desktop. Oh, good point, Rebecca. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and say, yeah, I know a lot of organizations, particularly like governments, will restrict access to the Microsoft store. So in that case, sometimes you can use Excel Online and that works. They don't seem to have the same, sometimes don't have the same restrictions on that. And if that doesn't work, go ahead. You can always contact our BCA helpline and we can help you out and try to, give you some instructions to send to your IT department or whatnot.
Excellent. So once we have it all downloaded, we can add the project, add the intervention type, and start adding properties. To get started, we'll just go up into the add project tile. The first thing to do is to add a project name, basically, a project location. Oh, nice. Okay. Project location. For ours, we're just looking at Guilford, Connecticut. You can also, so if you're doing specific properties, it would also be good to maybe give the exact latitude and longitude. But just for display purposes, I'm just going to type in Guilford, Connecticut for now. So this is the area where you're going to kind of set up your project, select your mitigation action type, what type of property you're looking at here, how you're going to model the damages and the frequencies, and also establish your costs. So there's lots of drop-down bars basically, and we'll go through. And since we were not doing any property-based like avoided damages for the Chittenden project, what we did is we selected other for our property structure type. However, if you're having residential buildings, non-residential, you would just make that selection here for your property type. So I'm going to select other, and then you'll want to select your hazard type. So what are we looking at here? Are we looking at riverine flooding, coastal flooding, hurricanes, etc.? For coastal floodings, A and V, this is, I believe it's the different ways that we categorize different flood events. So there's, if you look at like flood risk maps from FEMA, there's different categorizations of flood zones, zone A, zone B, and you can just, what I would recommend doing is looking at those maps, seeing where your property is within those flood zones and then assigning it that way. The one that we were in, since it was a mix of both, we selected the coastal unknown. Once you've selected your hazard type, you would want to select your mitigation type. So is this an acquisition project? Is this an elevation, etc.? So for us, we were looking at basically floodplain and stream restoration. Even though we're looking at coastal floodland or coastal wetlands, it's very similar to a restoration project. So that's what we selected. And then this is an important bit right here, how you're going to quantify your damages and your avoided damages. Do we have a question? No, got it. Sorry about that. So yeah, so this part will modify the dialog boxes that will be presented to you next. So you can go and quantify your damages one of three ways. You can either model it through H&H studies, showing basically how your project is going to augment the current flood risk and exposures, basically. You can use historical damages at certain reoccurrence intervals. So let's say you had a 100-year storm hit your community in the past, and you have actual catalog damages for each property or averages for property types. Basically what we're saying is that an event of this caliber has hit you before, and this is what the damage was, and you can use that information or data to project your future losses. Or you can have a professional expected damages. I'm not too familiar with this one, but from the best of my knowledge, it's similar to like an assessor's valuation. It's basically looking at the estimated, like having somebody who's a professional in that realm say that this is what you could expect to lose at this given interval of a storm. Which one you select will change the dialog boxes later on, but I would say that the most heavily used one, not even heavily used, but most like data intensive one would be the model damages. So I'll just go ahead and select that one to show you the type of data that would be required to perform a model damage approach. Moving on from there, so now that we have kind of our basic, our property being laid out before us, so we're figuring out what's the issue here, like what's the risk, how are we addressing the risk, what kind of property it is, where is it, how are you modeling these damages or avoided damages, and then it will ask you to input your cost estimation. So the first thing off is your project useful life years. So this is how long your property, or not your property, but your intervention, how long will your project actually be in use, and how long you will be maintaining that project. If you are going to be managing it in perpetuity, FEMA suggests using a 100-year lifeline. I see that we do have a question from Catherine. If you want to go ahead and we can answer it now.
Yes, thank you. It just, before we go on, I wanted to go back to the professional expected damages button. If you have a applicant that hired a contractor to develop drawings and cost estimates and such, could that button be used for those sorts of things?
Carson, do you want me to take that one?
Yeah, I'm not
Okay.
as familiar with that one.
I'm
That'd be
happy to
great,
answer
Rebecca.
that one. So
Yeah.
So the cost estimate in the design drawings are slightly different than sort of the estimated damages. A lot of times the same contractor might do them, but what we're looking for with the professional expected damages is a knowledgeable professional, which often is an engineer or someone that's knowledgeable about the facility, to estimate what the damages would be in a specific recurrence interval event. So like, let's say like the 100-year flood or something, they would need to estimate, okay, in the 100-year flood, this property is going to receive, I don't know, $20,000 in damages or something, and then document that. That's really what we're looking for there.
Okay, so this is more of just a initial site impact determination by somebody who's qualified then.
Correct, yes.
Okay, all right, thank you. I appreciate the clarification.
Yeah, and then this cost estimation area is just like your construction costs and your operation management costs to facilitate that intervention at the property. And so it gets a little interesting here in the case of the Chittenden project, because we have a single intervention that would theoretically protect multiple properties. So what I would suggest here is, like, you can't break up the cost based on each property, because it's the same. It's one single project protecting, say 5 houses. I guess you could maybe divide the total cost by 5, or you could just input the entire cost into one property and then have no cost assumptions on the other properties. It's just making sure at the end that your whole project construction costs and operation maintenance costs are being considered. And maybe Rebecca could speak on this more, but from my knowledge, as long as you're getting all your costs in there, it wouldn't really matter how you divvy it up.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, ideally, someone might write kind of a little narrative or put a note here kind of in the comment field, kind of explaining how they broke up the costs, just so the reviewer understands why certain costs are assigned to certain properties. But yeah, and there's really no right or wrong way to do it. You can't put in 0 costs, because then you are dividing by 0, and you can't do that. So you do have to put in at least $1. But yeah, sometimes we see that a lot, where someone will put the total project cost on one property and then the rest are just $1.
Yeah, excellent. So in our case, we were just looking at the ecosystem service value. So we only had one single property anyways. So we just went in ahead and put our entire project cost into here. I'm just going to put $3 million just as a placeholder. We could go in and do different scenarios, but it's not really important. I guess it's just seeing how it's being put into the benefit cost analysis toolkit is the value here. And then So this is your project initial cost. So the total cost for the construction of the project. And then this is your annual O&M cost, or your maintenance cost per year. For this one, you would just put in however much you think, or however much it is for you to go in and treat your intervention to make sure that it is fully capable of producing its full services throughout its lifetime. Once you figure that out, the toolkit will project these costs throughout the project useful lifetime, which in this case we have set to 100 years, or quote in perpetuity for all contexts and purposes. Once you've filled this out, you can go ahead and hit the next button. And this is where the meat and potatoes of the entire toolkit is basically. This is where we're going to calculate the avoided damages for each property, given a certain hazard probability reoccurrence interval, basically. So this is the model damage approach, and this is why I wanted to kind of show us or get everybody kind of familiar with model damages. I would say it's a good way to go through if you don't have the historical damages. I've seen lots of H&H studies. They take lots of work, but they're definitely needed to show how your intervention type is going to augment risk. And so, that's kind of the whole point, the whole purpose of this resilience, intervention is to change the risk. So we have to know how it's going to be changed. To figure that out for each property, we're going to have to know a little bit more about the property itself and the actual structure. So this is where you're going to input more unique, or your more site specific characteristics of that property. And for example, your lowest floor elevation, your ground surface elevation, and your base flood elevation. So what we're trying to establish here is how high up is your property, how high up is your structure, how high does your area flood, and what's the difference between all of those. So let's say you have, let's say your lowest property is, let's say, 3 feet off the ground, and your ground elevation is, let's say, 5 feet, but you have a base flood elevation of 9 feet. So that would mean that you have 1 foot of flooding in your structure. If you take the differences between, how high your surface is, how high your property is above the surface, and how high your base flood elevation is before your intervention. And so this is what helps us figure out how much of the home is being, damaged due to these floods at specific reoccurrence intervals. And this is how we kind of figure it out and model it. So this is really important to have. And without this, and your H&H study, you can't do your model damages approach. And so you would have to rely on your historical or professional approach. Here's your additional projected sea level rise above your base flood elevation. So if you have some insight into your area as to how sea level is going to augment your base flood elevation, you can go ahead and enter that here. And this is really the important part. It's the before mitigation and after mitigation. This is what's going to allow us to quantify our avoided damages. These are your different reoccurrence intervals. A lot of times it's the 100-year interval. So let's just say your still water elevation before your project was 9 feet, and then after it was reduced to, let's say, 7 feet. For this property, if that was the case, if we look back up here, this would put us out of the flood zone essentially. So like your avoided damages would be, you would have no damages. So all the damages from 1 foot of flooding would be avoided. That's how this toolkit works. That's the very basics of it. I'm probably oversimplifying it, but just for the context of this and getting us familiar, I think it's important just to understand the process in which it's going about the quantification. So once we know the differences in flood elevations before and after mitigation, we can input our valuations basically for the property. So how, what's the size of the property, what's in, what type of property is it have any flood proofing on it before. It's all these site specific characteristics that you have to input that will inform the toolkit of the value of the home. And once you have a general idea of the value of the home, it will, based on the reduced level of flood risks or flood elevations, it will calculate the avoided flood damages. I think I see some chats going in. Is there any questions that I should be answering right now?
Yeah, I think there was just some questions about how to enter the sea level rise projection into the tool.
I'm not.
Oh, yeah, I can take that. Yeah, so usually, I mean, as long as it's from a reputable source, the most common ones we see are NOAA and the Army Corps of Engineers. Sometimes communities might have a local study from a university or something that's fine to use as well. And as far as the projected year to use, as long as it's within the project useful life, you can use whichever projection you want. The key thing to remember is that if you include sea level rise in the BCA, the project needs to be designed to mitigate that. It's more relevant for like home elevations, but sometimes we'll see applications where they include sea level rise in the BCA, and then you look at the project design and they haven't actually elevated the home high enough to account for the sea level rise. So that doesn't quite cut it, but you know, for some, you just need to make sure that you're keeping that in mind with the project design as well.
Excellent, thank you. So moving down, we would fill in all of this, but so you can go ahead and select what type of, building, what's it being used for, essentially, what type of building is it? Is the building engineered? Is it have an active NFIP policy, etc.? And then we'll get down into the standard benefits. So this is the avoided benefits, essentially. This is how we're going to project damages for a property or a structure at different flood levels. So what we would do is input. So the way that FEMA estimates avoided damages is through what's called damage curves. And what that does is it, through primary research, looking at of historical damages, let's say that 1 foot of flooding has occurred, and we have all these different inputs, and we see that like 10% of the home is lost at 1 foot of flooding, 30% is lost at 2 foot of flooding. That's essentially what a damage curve is. It's the relationship between the elevation of flooding and the percent of the structure lost due to the flooding. And so that's what we would select here. And what we're inputting here is basically the value of the home, and then how much of that value would be lost due to the elevation of flooding. So you would enter in your square feet here, your building size, your first area floor, because this is really important, because obviously your first level is the one that's going to be damaged first, but also the total building size may have implications as well. If it's a 2-story, there may be structural issues that would have to maybe be addressed, things like that. So this is where you're informing the tool of the specifics of your structure, and how, and the value of that structure, so it can be quantified of the avoided losses. Paul, yeah, do you have a question?
Yeah, quick question. How did you do this relative to the Chittenden project, or did you just skip through this? How'd that work?
Exactly. So since we didn't have any properties being directly protected, we didn't have an H&H study, so we didn't know how our intervention type would augment our flood risks. We were specifically interested to see how the ecosystem services would compare, and so we just left all of this blank. But this is where you would input those that information for those properties, essentially. Building replacement square feet. So these are default values, and I would, if you don't have, supporting documentation, I would just use the default settings within the toolkit. Your demolition threshold essentially means how much, what percentage of the home can be lost before it's just easier to demolish the whole thing. Expected annual losses, I believe these will self-populate according to the building size and the damage curve that you've selected. And that will calculate your avoided damages due to the decrease in flood elevations. So not only is the actual physical structure being damaged, but also there's other types of damages as well, such as like personal damages. Now I can't get to work. Now you can't go home at night, so you have to go lodge somewhere else. Your contents within there, you can input those. And so this is where it's just, you get more fine detailed into the other avoided damages or losses of services due to the decrease in flood risk. So this is your displacement costs, essentially. So how many people are in the residence? Once again, if you don't have documentation or support that you can add to this, I would just use the default settings. And once you input, the amount of people within the residence, it will go ahead and self-populate with the avoided displacement costs. Loss of function or income. So this is another cost or avoided cost. So the annual operating budget. So this is for if you're a more commercial property. So let's say you have an operating budget of, $1,000, a couple $1,000s a day or whatever, and your property gets flooded, you can't, operate for that day. So you're going to lose out on all of that income that you would have had before. So that's another avoided cost that you can enter here. Volunteer costs. So this is the number of volunteers, I believe, required to help recover from the disaster. So, placing sandbags, things like that, helping debris, number of days volunteers lodging. So it's just like how many people are helping you with this disaster, and how many people would not be needed now because that these structures are not at risk. And then we get into our ecosystem services, and this is where we were really focusing on. This is the ecosystem services of your property or of your intervention area or your property that's being protected. So your total project area would essentially just be, for us, it was our intervention site. So that shoreline essentially, which was, I believe it was 11.08 acres. You can use acres or square feet by toggling this on or off. And so what the ecosystem services does is you have to first input the total area, and then you have to input the percentage of land cover distribution within that area. And if we look back or remember back to that table that I was presenting before, this is where you set your total extents. So for us, it was a majority of coastal wetlands. So let's just assume.
Carson, I believe this breakout session ends in 30 seconds, according to something that popped up on my screen.
Oh, shoot. Okay.
Yeah, we have, I guess we're getting called back to the other room.
All right. So,
You're almost done.
yeah, you input it here. It will self-populate this benefit cost ratio, essentially. And then at the end, it will present it to you as the overall. And then you can go, if you have more than one property, you just go ahead and.
And that there is. Oh, yes. Thank you, Sarah Powell. You got it. Okay, thanks. We are going to record the breakout so that we can share these. So just FYI on that. Okay, so today you're in the breakout for making the case for nature as critical infrastructure. So we've seen that I think there is some momentum to consider nature as critical infrastructure, but there is a lot more work to do and thought and considerations. So today we want to talk about, have a little bit of a discussion on this, and we set up a Jamboard, and I am going to stick that link in the chat, so you guys can go to the Jamboard, and then I'll also share my screen here in just a minute.
And I'll note, if you're having trouble getting on the Jamboard, or you know, don't feel comfortable doing that, you're also welcome to, you know, as we discuss, I'll take some notes in there for us as well. So no worries if it's not working for you today.
Okay, are we seeing the Jamboard, right? Okay, great. So yes, so we have 3 questions, and I'll tell you what they all are, but then we'll start with question 1. So the first thing we wanted to talk about is, where and in what ways does nature function as critical infrastructure in our region? Then the second, we thought we'd talk about what are the barriers to ensuring the protection of natural infrastructure. And then we're going to end with, you know, how can we incorporate more of these nature-based solutions into our hazard mitigation planning and make this, you know, more of the norm. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. You can either, we're going to start with this question 1. And Sarah, do you know, did Anthony say when we're coming back to the main room?
Yeah, he did not. Maybe I'll just try to shoot him a message. I've set a timer here to kind of, I gave us a few less minutes than we were anticipating, so I'm assuming maybe we'll have the full time, but so I'll keep an eye on the time.
Okay, so we'll probably spend maybe about 8 minutes or so on each question. Sarah's going to be our timekeeper. Or we'll move on once people, you know, the discussion slows down. So you guys can either add your own notes and comments into the Jamboard by using the sticky note function here on the left. So you use the sticky note, type your thought in, save, and then it'll pop up. Or you can, if you're not comfortable doing that, or you just want to, you know, verbally say your thought, we can also type it here for you. So we're going to provide all sort of avenues with whatever people are comfortable with, saying it out loud, or just sharing it through the Jamboard. So with that, let's get started with where and in what ways does nature function as critical infrastructure in our region?
So maybe another, just to get folks thinking in terms of where, you know, we could also think about this question, and I see peaches, yeah. You know, whether or not there are key places and locations where either, you know, these features already exist or should be invested in for resilience. So, okay, awesome. I see some people putting stickies in. That's great.
Wave attenuation, storm reduction, these are great. Erosion control. Are there any specific, to Sarah's, what Sarah's saying, are there any specific examples or places that people, you know, really feel that nature is acting as critical infrastructure? And again, if you want to come off mute and say your thought, please feel free to do that as well. I see one in the chat for Long Island, supplies and recharges groundwater. That's a great one.
Like the transfer.
We're really filling up the board here, so I feel like we have at least this group has a good understanding how nature does really act as critical infrastructure.
Nice to see some locations popping up. This is good.
So there's a lot on cleans our water, wave attenuation, storm protection, erosion protection, recreation benefits, carbon sequestration. And then, yeah, we're starting to get some examples from specific places, which is great. Okay, you guys seem to have slowed down maybe a little bit with adding to this one. I think we have a lot in here. Does anyone want to come off mute and say any of their thoughts, or we can I see a few more popping up, so I'll give you guys another minute and then maybe we'll move on to the next question.
That's right in line with our timing, so. Job, everybody. Yeah, this looks like my desk, John. I agree. I love it. Organized chaos. No, this is all great.
Yeah, oyster reefs, that's great.
I love the little +1. I wish they would make it like a built-in feature to just do that. It's
Yes,
we
yeah.
probably have a lot of +1s everywhere, but I like that.
Okay, well, I think why don't we move on to our second question? This was really great, so we'll see if you guys fill up this board as quick as you did that one. Thank you all. So now let's talk about, so what are some of the barriers to ensuring this protection of our natural infrastructure, and how do we maybe need to change our views and our policies to, start protecting this infrastructure like we do other infrastructure?
This is John. Can I just come off mute and talk for a sec?
Absolutely.
Sorry. So I think I was hinting at this in the chat right before. I think a lot of it has to do with perceptions of particular agencies, particularly FEMA. There's a lot of talk about protecting lives and improve property. Even a lot of their policies in terms of what they will do for like public assistance after disaster. They'll pay for public infrastructure, buildings. Lack of funding is certainly a big one too. But things like beaches, unless the beach is engineered to a specific cross section, FEMA often isn't going to pay for things like beach nourishment or other programs like that. Do we know they're important? Of course we do. It's just that's how some of the policies are set up. So I think it's almost just kind of an old guard view of some of these agencies on how they look at things. So I don't know how to fit that on a stinking sticky note, but. that
Yeah,
was
I'll
my
say I
thought.
think maybe, oh,
Okay,
Sarah's
yeah,
got it.
just stuck
Okay.
it. Let me know if what I put in there is accurate. But basically,
Yeah.
it's just being aware of perceptions of agencies' roles and their policies. I think
Yeah.
that's a good example.
Yeah, FEMA is definitely, I've worked in support of FEMA stuff for 25 years, and there's just very much like certain people are like, well, you can't do that because it's, I'm like, you really can, but sometimes people get inflexible about things. So, all right, that's my soapbox. I'm going to stop.
No, thank you. It's great. Yeah.
And I actually want to follow up on that as well, because I actually, before I started working in Audubon, I worked for the Army Corps of Engineers down in Jacksonville District in Florida. And the first instinct is, let's engineer something, let's build something, let's put in physical infrastructure. And then, oh, well, we're putting in this physical infrastructure, we need to consider how it's impacting the environment, not necessarily the other way around. So
More
that
concrete solves all your problems, Phoebe.
exactly.
There you go.
So that's one thing that is, I'm not sure how exactly we go about addressing that, because it is such an institutionalized, long held system of let's build something to fix it. Oh, wait, it might hurt nature, as opposed to, well, we've got an issue. Maybe we can see if nature can solve this before immediately jumping to the biggest, most intensive structure that man can engineer.
And maybe related to that too is just we don't have a great history of this. Often when we try to help a natural process along, we screw it up. We put in a groin, we put in something else to control erosion in one area, and we end up depleting the beach in another area. We cause an inlet to move. So, well-meaning Corps of Engineers, all props to them and other agencies. Sometimes they're trying to do something right, but end up making it worse.
So there's also not a lot of funding available for these federal agencies to do adaptive management and monitoring afterwards. So that's maybe an area where some of our agencies who are on the line and our groups could potentially come in and help and say, well, we've done this, you all have done this big project. Can we get funding together to monitor this and to look at adaptive management down the line, so that when issues arise, there's at least a plan in place, there's monitoring there to show, yep, this is a demonstrable concern, and these are the steps that we can take to help mitigate that. So that could be potential little inroad that we can take, as opposed to changing the whole system, helping out a little bit on that back end to make any positive changes as issues arise.
Yeah. And I think also from a benefit cost standpoint, we're really good at quantifying the benefits of avoiding damages to buildings and other infrastructure. We're not too good at protecting, what's the benefit of the natural environment? Well, we have those ecosystem service benefits. We've only had those since 2012, 2013. We're still working on them. And there's not a lot of guidance on how to actually quantify things like the benefits of doing a green infrastructure project or doing like a green roof or something like that. So we're better at quantifying the brick and mortar stuff. So
I almost wonder if, as all of the groups who are on are doing these types of green infrastructure projects, if there's some sort of standardized protocol that we can develop together that has us be able to analyze, do monitoring, and quantify the work that everyone's actually currently doing to gather more data to demonstrate these are the benefits from the green infrastructure. And then once we have enough data, it's much easier to change a system by saying, look at this wealth of knowledge that can help shift the viewpoints. So that's something I'm trying to think of, what are the main issues? What can we do on this scale? And I'm wondering if having sort of a standardized data collection that, all the groups who are doing this work can use to get that background and that information to demonstrate that this is important. That might be something that we could logistically do.
I mean, this might go to the next one we're looking at, but I know FEMA just started coming out with some unit benefits for some of the green infrastructure projects. I think they've got a unit benefit for green roofs, for bioswale, for tree planting, and I think permeable pavements. New York City has some additional guidance. I'm a little biased because I helped write some of them. Doesn't mean they're great, but so I know FEMA's starting to do that, but it's still pretty early. So
yeah, this is Rebecca Cassay, trustee in Port Jefferson Village on Long Island North Shore. I've the way that I've found to get fellow board members and leadership and staff interested in any kind of project, with natural infrastructure is by pointing out the fiscal benefits of the project. And so it's very encouraging to see these conversations continuing to develop, but continuing to make the data very available to local governments seems to be really important, because I peck and scratch and try to find anything I can on my time. And I know Elizabeth is always quick to answer emails and super helpful with resources. But being able to have this information in a database, like Phoebe was saying, where we can all just go to this. It's not one person trying to do PhD's worth of thesis research to prove that we should be daylighting this or using natural infrastructure here, or whatever it is. It just it would be great to get to that point where municipalities, at their village level, town level, county level, are able to look at a resource and that is a little bit more accessible than something else.
That's a great point, because we really, kind of like goes both ways. We need to like show the financial benefits of protecting nature so that we can encourage more of these projects. So we need to figure out, how can we improve those estimates and get more estimates of all these benefits from protecting our natural infrastructure.
Like as the projects are done, I think it would be really helpful to say, okay, here's I'm personally obsessed with New Haven's bioswales and rain gardens and collecting retaining the stormwater where it is, as opposed to letting it run to one area. And so being able to use that as a case study and say, okay, here are all of the benefits financially of each of those individual bioswales or rain gardens and the project as a whole. Again, just having sort of the bottom line numbers is usually counterintuitively the first step of a conversation to getting people interested in having the conversation at all. Because I am a crunchy granola tree hugger type, but I have to that's not going to open any ears. It's just, now I've found that the language that most people speak who are not on this call are, what is the financial benefit to the municipality? And so starting there, and then when they put the trees in, I'll give them a hug.
Yeah, I'm a heartless structural engineer that likes to build stuff in parking lots, but you all are winning me over as time goes on.
There you go.
I mean, and for me, we were doing some development in Virginia Beach, and we were actually showing the economics of this one undeveloped subdivision. Like, what's the most cost-effective mitigation for long-term sea level rise? I'm like, you really want to know? They're like, yeah. I'm like, don't build there. And I showed that with the environmental benefits over the next 100 years, the benefit cost ratio of leaving that undeveloped was actually double what you would have gotten if you built and elevated. I don't know if they convinced them, because it's hard to convince people of making a smaller tax base, but I was at least able to say, hey, these are the numbers we're looking at. The other things we sometimes do post-disaster, we do regulatory losses avoided, where we kind of say, if you had implemented this regulation, these are the savings you could have had over the project. Or this is what you could have avoided in this event. We did that after a couple of floods in Colorado a few years back, and we haven't done it since. I would love to see it applied somewhere else, but it's really just kind of a way of saying, yeah, if we had done this, could have saved this.
We're finding too, in being a board working with engineers, engineers often will not give that kind of answer, and if they do, it's sort of swept aside. It's usually, we would like you to build us something to stop erosion. Like here in Port Jeff, we had a bluff wall that was just finished. It was a $5 million project, very controversial here, and it's hardscaping, and there wasn't a lot of conversation back from the engineers as far as how long is this really going to last, and what might the implications be to the beach, which now isn't being fed by anything because there's a harbor entrance right next to it where the sand would usually sort of feed down the line. And so I I don't want to say that you use the word heartless. I think,
No,
but,
it's not.
no, but I don't blame them because on a business level, they're asked to design something and they take money to design something, and so it's they're doing what they're asked to do, and so what is the responsibility of engineering firms and other folks who are looking at infrastructural projects for issues like flooding and erosion to bring these to not just bring up these like green infrastructure, but also to push it as something to explore.
Yeah.
Because not every mayor or board is going to know to ask for it.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of success when you combine the gray and the green infrastructure together. You have the structural wall, but you're doing other things to pull it together. And honestly, it's easier to quantify the structural wall than it is the green. So you can get some of the economic benefits from doing the wall, but you'll also have that, it's almost like kind of like a hybrid car, right? Like getting a little bit from each side. So, and don't worry about hurting my feelings. I've been a government contractor for 25 years. So I'm good.
This is a great discussion. I think we're already starting to kind of get into our third question, and I think we're getting short on time. So I'm going to try to move us on, but I think we can continue on these lines. How can we incorporate more nature-based solutions into our hazard mitigation planning? And on that line, that we're just talking about, to kind of start thinking about these things, not just immediately the hard infrastructure, but thinking more about the natural and soft structure or the hybrid solutions. How do we start to get more of that into our hazard mitigation plans and into our planning in general?
One line of thinking that came to mind as Rebecca and John were just chatting right now is how many engineers are trained in this sort of area? Because, if you're, as a non-engineer, I assume when you get your engineering degree, it's mostly based on more of that hard infrastructure, because that's where all the mathematics is, that's where all the data lies, whereas green infrastructure is relatively new to quantification specifically. So that's kind of a question is, are a lot of these engineers fully aware of all these different resources, different opportunities, the green and gray combined? And if not, are there potential programs that we could develop that help work with these firms and these engineers to give more information sort of even at the very get-go and let them know, there are, in addition to these hard structures with all the complicated mathematics, here's some more information on some of these green options that have these values associated with them at the moment. And obviously they'll evolve over time, but just getting that awareness and that knowledge base out there, because I'm, again, not an engineer, so I'm not sure how much is or is not currently in the mind of the average engineer as they're working on their projects. So that's kind of an area I think that would need more research and more communication and coordination to see if this is something that could be valuable or even viable.
Yeah, it probably depends firm to firm or engineer to engineer. But there, John or anyone else, correct me if I'm wrong, there's continuing education requirements, right? Do engineers have those?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. So, that seems like a good pathway maybe to look into as far as having, seminars, webinars, whatever it is, as well as information that just can be sent out. And hopefully over time, what's being taught in universities has more of this focus. So there's all these different sort of from the immediate to the long-term education outreach, because if you have people in the chairs who this is foreign to as well, then it's not going to be something that they're willing to speak on because they don't have confidence in the effectiveness of it, or they don't have confidence speaking to it, and so they're just going to go back to their concrete. And like John's saying, sometimes like usually a mix of things is good, but if they don't know sort of what else to mix it with, that's a challenge.
At GCA, we started a focus group about 2.5 years ago called Design with Nature, and we asked people based on their background would be interested in promoting this to clients. It's worked really well. We get together once a month, we get guest speakers, we have a training topic. We're doing living shoreline training for the coastal group, you know. It's worked out really well, better than we expected. We got 90 people in it. We're only 700 people in it.
I have to think over time too, as projects start to be built and show longevity and effectiveness, that's really, you know, the projects will sell themselves. I feel like a lot of the struggle that we have here is we'll talk about these sorts of projects and then struggle to look at case studies or you know, municipalities that did similar you know, green infrastructure projects, because they're just either they're just being done, they're being discussed, or they have just finished, but everyone's still a little shaky on how long they're going to last and what they're actually going to do. So, you know, hopefully yeah, and I always push us to say, well, let's be on the leading edge of things, and be one of those case studies, because it's sort of a chicken and an egg thing. But hopefully, as those
Well, and that kind of first move in the market, you know, if people are willing to take a chance on it, and you know, finding the funding is usually the hardest challenge. Keep it going.
Yeah, no, this is a great discussion. I just wanted to flag John's hand was up there. John, if you're able to come up here.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in. I typed this in as a sticky note, but a lot of times I see we start from, you know, looking for the nature-based projects before we look at the hazards. And, you know, I think a lot of times this makes sense in terms of aligning projects with grant funding, but it doesn't necessarily address the highest priority projects for the community. So I feel like we need to start with the highest priority issues and then look for the NBS options that will best address that, rather than starting from a place of we're already decided NBS is the priority, and then we're going to look for communities' problems that overlap with the strategy that we want to favor. Because I think it causes a misalignment between you know, the technique and sort of, or basically it comes down to an issue of priorities. And you know, even the Chittenden Park project, which is great, but you know, I'm not certain whether that's like the highest priority hazard for even the town of Guilford, you know, much less the region or for the state. So, you know, I just want to get that out in this discussion, is, you know, because I think that we've sort of lost sight of that in recent years.
I think we're about to get kicked out, so thank you, everyone.
All right. Yeah. So Ethan, you want to do a quick intro?
Sure. So I'm Ethan. I'm the lecturer at the University of Exeter, which is the UK way of saying assistant professor. I'm also an affiliate of this great institute we have here, the Land, Environment, Economics, and Policy Institute. And we're kind of dedicated to developing data-driven tool sets for land use decision-making. So one of the big projects our institute is working on at the moment is called Net Zero Plus here in the UK. And we're interested in figuring out, like, if we're going to plant trees to offset carbon, it's not enough that we should just plant the average tree. What type of tree and where, under what scenario do we need to plant in order to maximize our investment? The return on investment. So but I was invited by Deb. Thank you again for the invitation. So I just started here in the UK this academic year. Before that, I was doing my PhD at Yale School of the Environment in Natural Capital, and was the Connecticut Sea Grant Marine and Coastal Economics Fellow.
Nice. Well, it's really good to meet you.
Miami, Florida. So.
Oh, you're from Miami. Okay.
All any coast. I've been there.
Yeah.
Quite the variety.
Well, it sounds like you know Deb. Here's Olivia. Olivia, we're the small crew. We get to just chat for a half hour.
This is the fun group.
Yeah, this is the fun group. Ethan, have you met Megan before?
No, hello.
I don't think so. or Olivia. Hi, both of you.
Hi,
Yeah,
hi.
either one. So Megan, do you want to do a quick intro and then?
Sure. Yeah. I'm Megan Raymond. I'm a professional wetland scientist and soil scientist, coastal geomorphologist sitting in New Haven, right down the road from Yale, right up the road from Anthony. We do a lot of, I work with SLR. We were Mylon and MacBroom, but now we were merged into SLR a few years ago, but it's actually kind of interesting because SLR is a UK-based firm. So I work with a lot of colleagues in the UK that have, and I think the UK really has, and the EU in particular, has really been out front on the whole natural capital kind of analysis. And so I've been working with some ecologists and economics kind of focused individuals in the UK on natural capital projects in the US. So I think you did you work with Eli Fenchel at Yale? Yeah, my husband's
Yeah.
a professor at Yale. He's a scientist, so
Yeah, I was just going to ask, is your husband Pete?
Yeah, he is.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, so I did my PhD with Eli.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but then in addition to like my best kind of hat that I'm wearing right now is that I'm project manager of this awesome Chittenden Park living shoreline restoration project, which we're really excited about, and finishing up the QOP now. So we should have a draft to you guys hopefully soon. And anyway, this is just a really interesting field that I'm really looking to kind of get into the metrics of, because as a scientist, to have that balance of the economics is just something that it's not my field, but I'm just certainly really curious and excited to learn more about it.
Awesome. Yeah, and Olivia is part of our project team for this with Earth Economics and has been truly wonderful. She's out on the West Coast, so we're spanning like 9 time zones here or something.
Right.
So yeah, this is great. Okay. I put a link in the chat to a Jamboard. So we're going to be using a Jamboard to kind of guide our discussion here. So I'm watching you join. We have Anonymous Ibex, Anonymous Dinosaur, Deb, and myself at this point. Cool. So did anyone have problems getting into that? No. Megan, are you in?
Sorry, does it pop up?
It should open a window
In the chat. Okay.
Oh, in the chat. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah,
Okay.
you'll have
Yep.
to go to a different browser. Yeah.
Yes, I'm
there
here.
You are. Anonymous sheep. All right. Okay. So we set this up, Deb and I set this up to kind of guide the conversation, but really, since it's such a small group, we can go where we want to go here. So we have this broken down by the recommendations from the report. The first one is viewing the environment as critical natural capital or infrastructure. This is different than the Breakout 2 conversation about, the philosophy and concept of that. And it's more about what impact would that have on a benefit cost analysis, right? So treating nature as critical infrastructure would allow its value to be counted as a benefit if the project preserves it, or a cost if the do-nothing object exposes it to degradation or total loss. So this is one sort of example of that. When we were talking with FEMA, they basically said, yeah, if you can produce some modeling that shows sort of erosion and flood modeling over time, that we'll say, okay, if we do nothing at this site, if we don't do this project, then 20 years from now, 50 acres of this marsh is going to be more regularly flooded, and it's going to be, expose other structures to flooding and that kind of thing. It's going to be in a worse condition. But if we do this project, it will preserve it or conserve it and protect it. Then we can take that whole 50-acre area, count it as a property, value it, possibly according to its ecosystem service value or possibly some other way, and add that to our benefits of avoided damages, avoided costs. So yeah, so this is one thing we can discuss. It was not perhaps the thing that jumped out to me as the best part of discussion for this, but here's recommendation 2, use new methodologies to incorporate more precise ecosystem service and recreational values. This is where we get into regional estimates.
And if anybody's not familiar, just at the top of the Jamboard, there's a little arrow. And you can see like a little 1 out of 6, and you click to the right, and you'll get to the second little slide for where Anthony is now.
Yeah, let me share my screen too. Oh, not that. Are you still seeing the PowerPoint?
No, we can see the
We're in,
Jamboard.
yeah,
Oh,
we're in
okay.
your board.
Okay, cool. So this is recommendation 2. And this is where we get into the regional estimates. And, you know, again, you know, someone used the example of a beach in Florida versus a beach in Maine having the same value. It's the same as saying an acre of coastal wetland in Louisiana has the same value as an acre of coastal wetland in Connecticut or New York. And so we're interested in talking through this a little bit. And I'm just going to give you a choice, but recommendation 3 is incorporating non-use values. So talking about, you know, how we might think about incorporating benefits that do not accrue directly to humans through our use of an ecosystem, but rather accrue perhaps indirectly by contributing to the biodiversity, the health, or the long-term stability of an ecosystem that does provide benefits to us. So does anyone have something you really want to start with and dive into? I think there's a lot of directions we can go.
I've got loads of stuff I can say, but
Yeah, I'd be curious to hear what you have to say, Ethan. I mean, I think starting with number 1 seems kind of, I mean, I guess I don't know about necessarily terming it critical infrastructure, but certainly having that having sort of that natural capital valuation.
Yep.
And
so a note here quickly, over to the left side, you'll see you have a toolbar here. You can hit this text box button and then just press anywhere and it'll let you type. And you can also hit the sticky note and it'll allow you to type in a sticky note and then it'll put it on the screen. So as we go through, you're more than welcome to sort of jump between slides or whatever you want to do and add stuff, add your own thoughts. But I can also scribe, or Deb can. So
yeah, one question I think about here is what would it take for that argument to be made to FEMA to treat something as critical infrastructure?
yeah, I think that'd be pretty hard, actually, considering like the FEMA mission, like that came up before in one of the chats about like their mission is to protect lives, right? And property, right? And critical infrastructure to them, you know, fire stations, police stations. It's just a different strata. So it might not be, yeah, FEMA. It might not be necessarily a FEMA specific.
I think what's really interesting about this is I like the question, Deb, you know, what would it take for this argument to be made to FEMA? And I think what it takes is enough projects or examples where, you know, we can do that kind of modeling and we can show that if we don't invest in habitat restoration, in ecosystem restoration right now, it will eventually cause a whole bunch of damage or expose a lot more exposure for a community in these areas of lives and built infrastructure down the road. You know, particularly with, you know, the mission being to also to improve the or to help mitigate against disasters and things like that. You can see that being an argument. Then it's just a longer timeline, right? In some cases, and it's a bit of a longer horizon or further horizon to view.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think
It's my
that,
kind of,
yeah, go
okay.
ahead. Sorry, Ethan. You go ahead.
I was just going to say that my stab in the dark is that one of the most effective ways to start increasing adoption of natural capital values in policy is to think about nature-based solutions as enhancements to existing infrastructure projects rather than the meat and potatoes of a project. So if you're going to build a groin, what does wetland restoration with the groin do to the hydrological modeling? And so it's a co-benefit, it's a complement to tried and tested Army Corps of Engineer projects that we know work, that we know produce benefits, that we know have kind of existing costs. Rather than say that we're going to substitute infrastructure that we know to work with something that's potentially risky, hard to measure, and kind of all over the board with the flaws that we've already discussed.
Yeah, I think the ability to measure is a key factor here too, right? Can something be, how is it measurable?
So yeah, measuring I don't know how to say that, measuring like the criticality of it, or measuring what I was talking about before, measuring the avoided cost, I guess.
Yeah, I think you could do it that way. You know, if you had like just like say an estuary, you know, maybe the Housatonic River, and you looked at wave modeling as it presently exists, and then you like in a storm event, and then you looked at the effect of the properties adjacent to the estuary, and then you took away all the marsh and then modeled like what would the inundation pattern be, and then you know it would be probably extremely significant. So it's just I think there's just a lot of analysis to get, I mean, to get to that takes a little bit to get there. That's not an easy kind of, you know, you're not, it's not, you have to move beyond the theoretical, I guess, to measurable. So
yeah, so that would be easiest to do if something's like directly adjacent to a building, you know what I mean? Like you can start kind of from where the infrastructure, traditional gray infrastructure is, and go out from there. And you know, maybe that would be the easiest way to get a measured benefit, you know, and then if you can change the precedent, you know, in that sense, it could open up more doors.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting about what you said, Megan, is you know, if we can measure the benefits that are already accruing from a given wetland or a site, right? And then we say, well, if that didn't exist, what would we have to do to provide that same level of protection or the same level of services that it's currently providing, and what would that cost? And that actually is a thing. FEMA does have that. It's called is that the existence value one, Olivia? I think it might be the existence value, whether they focus on replacement value or replacement cost. So I think the only ecosystem or land cover type that has a value for that right now is forests. But they've basically said, you know, if you wiped out a forest and then you had to replace it, you know, what is that going to cost per acre to replace a forest and the services that it provides? I would say that it's basically impossible to accurately value that, because an intact mature forest, for instance, I mean, does so much that we can't even know everything. But that is one potential avenue, is to say, you know, if we didn't have this marsh here, you know, and we didn't have that buffering value, what would it take to provide that same level of protection to the roads and houses behind it? maybe if you built a wall or tried to create marsh out of nothing, like how much would that cost? So that might be one way that we could do it.
I think you're thinking about the non-use value.
Okay, so that's, yeah, yep.
For time's sake, Anthony, we might want to page through to a couple of different questions. I'll note your addition there though.
Great. Okay, so we were talking about these values being slippery, right? So I think I have actually in the next one. Yeah, I have the whole chart here.
Yeah, that's helpful.
In the next one, which is helpful. And I had this idea that one of the things we could do today, if we want, is go through this chart and just sort of, pick out the ones that you feel are really overvalued or undervalued here. And then we can have a bit of a conversation about that. But first, so I just want you to know that's there so you can refer to it.
Mm-hmm.
So when we're thinking about this, what might some regional factors be that would impact the relative value of ecosystem services in the Long Island Sound region, or generally? So what regionally specific factors might come into play here that would produce a different value potentially for, say, coastal wetlands in Connecticut than it would in Louisiana, or a beach in Florida versus Maine?
I mean, there's loads, right? And I think the higher level question is like, what is it going to take to match up our data sets so that we get the most local estimates of the values that are being provided by extant ecosystems, right? Like, we have average values, and that's great. As I posted in the chat, like the National Strategy for Environmental Economic Statistics is going to try to figure out how to create a balance sheet of natural assets and the services they provide that's reflective of the heterogeneity that we see. Mm-hmm. So there are many of these services that just we already have economic values from. The problem is that they're mixed up. So when you go to a Starbucks in Malibu, your latte captures some kind of ecosystem service value from the aesthetics. Like, you chose to go to that Starbucks and you got this beautiful view, and somehow you were willing to buy this cup of coffee. And the rental price for the property that the franchisee pays, like, all of this is embedded, and we have to figure out how to disentangle it all. That's the challenge. The good news is that we have huge amounts of geospatial data that help us kind of figure out what's changing in nature. Remote sensing means that we don't have to send people out with, tools to try to measure certain parts of the environment. And we have all this digital economic data. We have business receipts from Starbucks. Like, no one knows how much rental value is happening thanks to partnerships with, is it BLS and BEA?
I'm not
to try to figure out the ecosystem services that come out of different places. So I think it's more than figuring out average values and their drivers, but trying to figure out, like, what's the pipeline for doing this every quarter, just like we do other aspects of economic data.
Yeah. I'm actually going to put this over here under pros and cons of utilizing regional or local values instead of standard national values. So I think there's a lot there.
Right, we can spend time talking about temperature and tourism patterns, but that changes every year, and increasingly so.
Valid. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a benefit to having the national average values, right? At some level, it just saves everybody time too.
Oh, and it's not zero. Like,
yeah, exactly.
I'm not saying that it's worse than zero.
No,
exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
And
yeah, totally.
Because then would allow analysts to then perhaps refine based on scarcities or prevalence of habitats, regionally. Like, I think you need to start. I think it helped. Like, we kind of need to start nationally and then hone in to locally.
The issues doing the local research is very expensive, depending on what you want to look at.
Yeah.
So that's a huge challenge, a huge obstacle.
There was also an article, a New York Times article about like proposals for like, seawalls and tide gates in, New York City area. And they mentioned that an environmental justice issue with like putting higher values on higher cost like homes. So like, which factors into this. So like poorer neighborhoods then are valued less, so would get less help.
Yeah.
And so that made me think about, in this conversation, how I could see the value of kind of leveling the playing field in some cases, like for equity.
Because it would be equitable, right, to do that, to not malign a resource as less value.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just shared in the main room the flow chart that they have for disadvantaged communities to help lower that threshold for the cost effectiveness, the BCR. So they have some, they've been thinking about this. I'd say FEMA's been trying to incorporate equity, but from the groups we work with, I know they're upset with some of the definitions of the disadvantaged community itself. But yeah, that's a really good point for thinking about, especially when you get into localized values property.
And hugely controversial, right? If you move into a disadvantaged neighborhood, however you want to define it, and you do something that increases public good provision, you're making those properties more valuable. Those properties are going to more likely not be owned by their occupiers, and you're probably going to induce rapid gentrification in the area. So there are all of these knock-on effects that happen after you make these changes. And it's really a tough problem. But I think the bigger theme to connect to is the benefits are going to accrue to different types of people differently. Some of these benefits are private and some of these benefits are public. So you could live in Connecticut and enjoy the benefits of Manhattan not underwater to a huge degree in a different way than someone like me who spends, lives in Manhattan part of the year.
Ethan, were you the one who asked about the beneficiaries?
Yeah.
That's a good question. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a great question. That wasn't something that we talked about or thought about really. But it's hard because of exactly what you just raised. Like, in some places there's going to be actual data that says this many people visit the site every year, and in other places it's just going to be like, well, I don't know, this many people drive by the site every year, are they getting something from this? So it's hard, but it's a worthy question.
I'll just kind of flag too, and then I'll stop because I'm taking up a lot of air, but non-use values, the extent of the market or the number of beneficiaries is the name of the game with non-use value, because you administer a survey and you end up multiplying it by the average or whatever number of people. And I was in a grant call here in the UK, and they wanted some non-use value work to be done. Someone said, well, are you guys looking for big numbers or small numbers at the end of the study for government? And it's like, yeah, that's a really silly question, implying that economists make up things all the time. But also, this person really knows their stuff, because they know that if you multiply it by the state of New York versus just the people who live in Battery Park, you're going to get two very different numbers if the unit that you've actually measured is, in your sample, the per person willingness to pay to not be in 3 feet of water while viewing the Statue of Liberty.
So Ethan, I want to ask you a quick question about that, because you understand that way better than I do. When we're talking about non-use values, and I know that a common way to do that is with surveys and just say, how much would you be willing to pay, right? So are you saying that a small sample size could just skew it greatly one way or the other? Or are you saying a larger sample size is always beneficial because you'll have more like cumulative value attributed to that thing? So like 1,000 people say it's worth $100 to me versus one person saying it's worth $100,000 to me, whatever.
Just briefly, it's usually you're going to get per person values and then multiply it by the affected area. So you're not going to survey the whole area for kind of the non-users that you're interested in. The survey instruments will capture, they're the only way we can capture non-use values, but they will also capture use values as well. And they're kind of the tool, contingent evaluation is a tool, we have to piece them apart. I guess the most helpful thing I can say, because I am extremely jet lagged and may say terrible right things and know I'm being recorded. The NOAA Blue Ribbon panel has the best set of recommendations for how to do that. And it talks about the income issues and all kinds of other things. But there's not much that I can add to the NOAA Blue Ribbon panel recommendations on contingent valuation.
Okay.
Great. Anthony, just quick time check.
Yep, time check. I was actually just gonna say I'm gonna close the rooms. So I wish we had another hour.
Do we have a takeaway from this session?
I've been kind of consolidating things to do a little summary report out. You know, I don't think there's one takeaway. I think there's more questions that we've posed, but that's I guess the path.
Can I ask one question? And this is something that was tacked on to a comment earlier this afternoon, and I was just curious what your thoughts very quickly on this were. But someone had said that they look at nature-based solutions as a 25-year timeline, and that's not at all how I look at those. I just was curious. We could just talk about this offline, but I'm just curious if like what the gut check of if anyone heard that or that resonated with anybody. That seemed like more of a solar panel type of like I'm hoping that's not what we're making. Well, it's interesting because do these things.
FEMA actually does have like recommended like useful life for each different type of thing of intervention, but you know, it all depends on how you maintain it or you know what the context
how it's designed for it. Yeah.
So I think along the lines that you do, like I think of it as being in perpetuity if it's done. I know we never have enough time in breakouts. And I'm sure that a lot of you just got cut off. So apologies for cutting you off. Can everyone hear me okay? Everyone's kind of coming back a little laggy.
I can hear you.
Okay. All right. I'm gonna go back to sharing my screen here. Hopefully that was helpful even for the short time we had, and we had some good conversation. Our room was quite small, which was actually nice. We got to get to know one another and chat a little bit, but still wish we had a lot more time. So let's do a quick, I didn't even do the instructions, but everyone found their way okay. So good job, everyone. And thanks to Olivia for hanging back and helping folks get in. All right, so we're going to share out really quick, and I'm going to actually ask the Sea Grant folks to take the lead on just bulleting some of the takeaways from your groups. Does anyone want to go first?
Should we start with group one? Hello, I'm Sarah Schaefer Brown. So I was in breakout room 1 with Carson, and he was going into the BCA toolkit in a little more detail. We did have a really good group. So, and thankfully Rebecca Carroll from FEMA was in the room as well. So she answered some of the questions. If you do want to tune back into our breakout room, Carson did go through the tool and how to fill it out. So I think that'll be a really good resource, and also how to download it. There was just some notes from Rebecca Carroll about how some entities might have security on add-ons that need to be downloaded for this program. So you might need to contact IT, or FEMA has a technical assistance line that can provide further assistance if needed. And then there was just some comments about how to calculate the expected damages for your project. So Carson went into a little detail about that, and the cost estimation table, and sea level rise projection tools that can be used to populate the table as well. The NOAA sea level rise tool was touted as a good tool to use, or the Army Corps also has a sea level rise projection tool that can be used. And then I guess some of the intricacies of how the Chittenden project was put into the system for buildings, standard benefits for buildings. I guess for the Chittenden project, that section was not filled out because it didn't apply. And this is, some of the conversation that we've been having so far. But I think it was a useful exercise to go through the tool for those involved. So yeah, props to Carson and Rebecca.
Yeah,
thank you,
Carson and Rebecca. I've seen Carson go through that before, and it is super helpful. So in the recording that we'll send around, if you want to check that out, you'll be able to. Okay. Does anyone from Breakout 1 have anything quick you want to add to that?
Yeah, we didn't get a lot of discussion. I took a long time to go through the tool and everything. So we had just maybe one step away from finishing up the entire tool. So if anybody has any questions or discussion points that you want to bring out now, maybe now is a good time to do that.
Or you can put questions in Q&A, since we're a little short on time, and we can try and record those or get those questions. Maybe put them in chat, actually. So I think the chat's saved. And then we can try and get some answers out. Okay.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and answer the Q&As and we can just continue on.
Okay, great. Thanks, Carson. All right, Breakout 2, Sarah or Elizabeth?
Okay, I'll try to start and then I'll let Sarah jump in. We had a great discussion in our room. We were filling up our Jamboards. So people had a lot of great thoughts and ideas. We were talking about making the case for nature as critical infrastructure, and started out by just talking about what ways nature acts as critical infrastructure in our region, or where there are specific locations we see this. So, we talked about how nature provides storm protection, water quality protection, carbon sequestration, erosion control, all the things that I think we all know about. And there were some specific examples that people were also throwing into the Jamboard, which was great. And then we talked about what are the barriers to protecting these natural features, and how do we kind of need to change our policies and views potentially. So I think some of those barriers we talked about were cost, lack of funding for projects, as well as maintenance and monitoring, the sort of regulatory challenges and different perceptions and policies, and also just that we don't have necessarily a great history of protecting nature, and there's not often, it's hard to find like these examples and case studies for people to look to. So I'm going to let Sarah jump in with anything else she wants to add on that one and our third discussion question.
Yeah, no, I think you've done a good job. I think, Anthony and others, when you see our Jamboard, she's not joking. It's really full. We had really great comments, lots of discussion. I'm just trying to scan through and see if there's anything, but I think you've hit most of the main points. And then I think, then that discussion led into our third question, which was about how could we incorporate more nature-based solutions in hazard mitigation planning? And, our discussion kind of continued along those same lines, and the need to publicize successful projects and case studies, and show the benefits to the public and local governments who are considering doing these things. We talked some about, you know, whether or not engineers are actually trained in these techniques and how we can broaden that knowledge base and awareness, and so that engineering firms maybe are prioritizing or bringing them up. You know, there's a lot of discussion about how engineers are hired typically to build things, and you know, can they get to a space where, you know, they're coming to folks and offering an array of solutions, including natural or nature-based features. What else did we talk about here? What am I missing, Elsa? I need, my font is too small. There's so many stickies. Or anyone else from the room, please speak up if we're missing a main point here.
I just made a gratuitous plug in the chat box for green infrastructure unit benefits being quantified for that third point. So
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
no problem.
Okay. Thanks, group 2. And group 3, Deb, you want to do it for our team?
Yeah, we were a small but mighty group in Breakout 3, and we were discussing improving the breadth and accuracy of ecosystem service values. So we went through the main 3 recommendations of the report. The first was about viewing the environment as critical natural capital or infrastructure. And we got into more of the logistics of that compared to the theme of Breakout 2. We discussed how FEMA's mission, you know, is focused on protecting lives and built infrastructure. So how do we make this argument to them, you know, to treat the environment as critical infrastructure? And one, you know, recommended technique is to perhaps think about the nature-based solutions as enhancements to existing infrastructure. So kind of starting with what's known and adding on to it. It could also be easiest to argue when you have quantifiable benefits. So a good starting point could be, you know, areas immediately adjacent to the existing infrastructure, and looking to get a different precedent set, you know, that you might have to open the door slowly or based on what's most in line with how FEMA works currently, to open that door a crack, and then maybe it could be open more in the future. Second, we talked about the second recommendation is about using new methodologies to incorporate more precise ecosystem service and recreational values. So in this case, there were a few points made about, you know, the benefits or drawbacks, you know, to having, you know, national versus more regional values. There is a lot of data out there, and, you know, we talked about the challenge with balancing it all, but with the amount of geospatial and economic data, there could be a lot to work with to get to, you know, more regional or precise estimates, but you might have to, you know, start with the national and go from there. We also discussed how the national values can have the benefit of leveling the playing field. So for the example of communities with environmental justice concerns, you know, their, you know, homes and areas are valued less, then you're going to get less, you know, dollars to help rebuild them, which is a known equity issue. So having, you know, national values in some cases can be a benefit. And there's a lot to consider also about like the number of beneficiaries. And that kind of got into the third recommendation, where we talked about incorporating non-use values. So something to be aware of here is that your sample size helps determine the size of the benefit for non-use values, because of the way you have the number of beneficiaries divided into the area, the physical area of space. So it was pointed out that NOAA has a blue ribbon panel set of recommendations that, some researchers consider like a really good place to start to understand handling non-use.
Great, thanks, Deb. Yeah, a lot of great conversations, sounds like, and a lot more to talk about. But we are at 3 o'clock. This time always flies. So what happens now? I mentioned before, everyone has the final draft report. That report's can be finalized by the end of June. So we'll send that around when it's in its final form. The recording of the workshop will be edited together and sent around. We'll also, I believe the chat was all saved. I hope it was. So we'll try and send that as well. And then just a plug here, the SRC folks who I shouted out before, if you're in the Long Island Sound region, they're phenomenal resources for, starting to assess potential projects and whether they might be a fit for a given funding source. They even have a little grant program to help, if you're a municipality, to help you write or get some grant writing help to put together an application. So great resource, and they can help you direct you at the right time toward groups like Save the Sound or Audubon or others who can help manage those projects and bring those funds in if you'd like. So final shout out to Rebecca and everyone from FEMA. They're making great strides on this stuff, and I think that was one of the big takeaways from this for me, is that this has come a long way, and they're still moving at a pretty quick pace, and there's some great new recommendations out right now that might be passed that would make this even more favorable in terms of the BCR and project eligibility. So thank you to everyone for taking 2.5 hours out of your Thursday to be with us. And I'm hoping that this was helpful and that you enjoyed your time together with this group. So thanks, everyone, and take care.